So I guess we'll just jump on into it. Yeah, so to my audience, yeah, we're gonna have this debate between these individuals. Well, not to be a debate, really just discussion between these individuals, and well, hopefully goes well. Hopefully everyone, does this in a non-blood sporty way. I think we can manage that. I think we can. I said that last time. I said that last Wednesday when we did this. We had not on this particular subject. I was wrong. We were talking about vaccines, and I was extremely wrong about that. So we'll see. I'll find out. But I'll introduce all these great people. Thank you, Shouts of Liberty, for stopping by once again. How are you doing?
Of course. Any day to be with on the Prime Case channel is a great day. It's good to be here. Glad to stop by, of course.
Are you well rested, like yesterday?
Yes, I'm not running on 0 hours of sleep in the past 36 hours this time. I'm actually very well rested, so I'm glad I can actually provide something to a discussion today.
Okay,
unlike Monday. So, yeah.
All right, fantastic then. Next, Aristocracy, who is
Hello.
Not at all a stranger to this channel. We're happy to have her back to be participating in this discussion. How are you doing today, Aris?
I am good. I thought I was going to take a break from streaming today, but, turns out I guess not. But it's okay. It's my favorite subject in the world. Totally not tired of talking about it or anything.
Well, thank you for stopping by.
But thanks for having me.
Of course, absolutely. Next, we have Sam the Human. Sam the Human. Hey, thanks for being here.
How's it going, Prime? It's been good. I just recovered from my vaccine, second vaccine. I took it on Monday. I was out of commission yesterday, so now I'm glad to be here talking to you. And remember to follow Eris's TikTok and follow me on Twitch. I'm going to start streaming a little bit more, now that school's done.
You're a little quiet, buddy.
He mentioned my TikTok. It's a big deal.
Just, you're a little quiet, Sam.
I'm a little bit quiet.
Yeah.
Closer enough, that'll help.
Yeah. Okay, but yeah. Thanks so much.
But yeah.
Okay, all right, sorry, great, thanks. So, moving on. Azkrath, hello, hey, hi.
Hey, yeah, so I'm not really... this is, I guess, my first time on officially on a panel, and not these unofficial things. Hopefully we can have a nice discussion. I guess, I've made a Twitch account. If people like what they hear, I guess you can follow me. I'm probably going to be doing some satisfactory sometimes, but don't expect me to do anything with any sort of schedule. Just maybe sporadically, when I find some cool stuff in games, and maybe I'll do a what's it called, a walkthrough of the I'm still fucking internet boomer, but whatever. Let's do some sort of playthrough of the new Mass Effect that I just got. So that's nice, the Legendary Edition. Maybe at some point, but hopefully we can get through this and not have it devolve into blood sports. That would be nice. And maybe we can just have a civilized discussion, hopefully, without everybody yelling at each other.
Hopefully. All right. We hope and pray. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take myself right here off the screen. I'm less important here. So we have a bunch of Jewish individuals here, and I would love to have included some Palestinians, but I don't. My reach is very limited. That's basically what I'm about to say.
Hold on. There's a very important caveat that I must include that apparently I forgot to include when Connor interviewed me. I am ethnically Jewish. I was not raised Jewish. My dad was raised Jewish, and my dad's side is Jewish. So I do have a fairly sufficient understanding of the religion. However, I was not raised Jewish. So yeah.
Okay. That's fine. All right. So
sorry. Just to clarify, I'm not Jewish, but I did get invited. So,
Oh,
but it,
Yeah.
mhm.
I
No.
guess no, but I guess I did get the impression because I did say some fair, like vaguely, like in defense of Israel type statements before, or I'm the other type of Orthodox, right? The Christian kind, not the, but I'm still, but I do have like a lot of experience in working with, this Israel-Palestine issue, especially because I have dealt with it like on campuses, and I've experienced people that have dealt with these issues like severely and have been afraid to be part of the university community and helping them out, have that not happen.
All right. So we'll get started. All right. So first question. As soon as I can pull up, you'd think I'd have it up already. When it comes to possible solutions, are you in favor of a single state or a two-state solution? Or possibly a three-state solution where Jerusalem becomes its own city-state similar to the Vatican? So each person will go down the line, give your opening to this, and then we'll have your own discussion. Shadows.
Okay, that's not the easiest question. I guess it's complicated because you threw in the Jerusalem part in there. So, generally speaking, and I'm sure we'll obviously get into the history and possibilities of each one. But I'm generally in favor of a two-state solution. Whether or not that's pragmatic, we'll get into. I don't think Jerusalem should be its own city, but I do see a possibility where East Jerusalem is sort of its own city or a UN-controlled zone, because I think it is very hard for there to be a possible two-state solution where Israel does not control East Jerusalem. It's because, this part of the city is very important to Christians, Jews, and Muslims, has a lot of holy sites. So I think it'd be hard for either side to say, oh, you can have East Jerusalem. I just don't think that's pragmatic or possible. But yes.
All right, we'll go to Ascraft next.
Yeah, so my ideas on a solution, I also don't think that like it's really pragmatic to like divide Jerusalem. I think it causes a lot of problems, especially if you want officially on a solution side, if we're going to have a divided Jerusalem. I don't think that's necessarily going to work, especially because of like the shared holy sites. I do think that Jerusalem kind of has to be a united city, especially because of like the complexities of the area, and because all of the holy, like most if not all, like the old city is generally considered to be part of East Jerusalem, and I don't think that especially when you have like sites like the Temple Mount and everything that are part of the old city and they're a part of East Jerusalem, I don't see any way that could be part of a compromise where, for example, Israel gives up control of the sites. But even now, I think the holy sites are managed by Jordan through some international agreement, right? Or at least the complexes. But when it comes to like a lot of the other situations, for example, how do we divide up the state? I find it very difficult to see like anything resembling the 1967 borders if Palestine remains armed, because in doing so, it's effectively acting against the rational self-interest of the Israeli state, because it would put a potentially hostile power and basically in the position to deny its water supply and within striking distance of most, if not all, of its desalination plants. That is like, I don't like, and in a position to, in an offensive, situation, if ever conflict breaks out, they will have like an offensive advantage because of the shape of the border. So a longer border generally favors, and a situation where there's a lot of salients, for example, the Jerusalem, which would be like the Jerusalem salient, massively favors any sort of like offensive doctrine where they can easily cut off and encircle forces. I don't see that like any military establishment, any state that's kind of thinking strategically to like say that like those borders will work. Like the 1947 borders were even worse. I'm not like, it's not to say that like there can't be any solution, right? like there have been other places in the world where there have been kind of like this type of conflict between two sides, especially religious conflict. My family, for example, has lived through the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and maybe there can be some sort of agreement. But like, if there's some sort of one-state solution, it has to be some sort of confederacy similar to Bosnia. Like, I haven't necessarily like looked into it all that much, but like something like a solution that resembles maybe something like Northern Ireland, where there's like a free border, where the areas like, there's demilitarized areas, but ultimately, you can't have peace like if Hamas is still in control of like any area of Palestine, because not because of Israel, but because of Hamas. If Hamas is there, then I don't think that peace is pragmatic within anybody's lifetime, because like so long as Hamas is there, so Hamas is in control, they're an existential threat to Israel. And I think a lot of people in Israel saw the withdrawal in 2005 as like a test case of what would happen if they simply unconditionally withdrawed, and Hamas took over and they started firing rockets. And so I don't think that there's like one of the conditions to peace has to be like Hamas is eliminated, but I also don't
wrap
think
it up
that like
so other people can go.
Yeah, right. So yeah, that's kind of in brief. Conditions for peace kind of have to be like the elimination, like Hamas has to go away. Effectively, they can't stay there. Jerusalem kind of has to be united. Whether or not it's like, I don't think an international condominium would work, especially because it has such a significance to very specifically, like the Jewish people. Jerusalem has extreme significance, and like two potential solutions that I see is maybe some sort of confederacy, maybe some sort of like single state, right, or a demilitarized two-state. But like having a militarized Palestine won't work, I don't think, especially because of like the rational self-interest angle.
Okay. In brief, he says. All right, thank you. Sam the Human.
I think that going forward, the only peaceful solution is either a 2 or 3 state solution, leaning towards like a 2-state solution probably. And I think most of this stuff has been like echoed by Shadows and Azarketh, and kind of just making sure that East Jerusalem is stays intact, not split. Seems like that's a huge issue, and creating some kind of peaceful transition where it is demilitarized and we have removal of radical groups in both sides, so Hamas and the Netanyahu kind of government in Israel.
All right, aristocracy.
I don't know. I think that the 2-state solution is the only viable solution. The only alternative to a 2-state solution is a 1-state solution where Israel controls the area, because Israel has nukes. So Israel is not going anywhere. So if anyone ever advocates for a 1-state solution, and they don't think that's going to end up with Israel in power or some kind of like apartheid-like system where Jews are like the first-class citizens over other non-Jewish people, they're like they're like operating just like not in any kind of sane realm. So the 2-state solution is the only viable option for Palestinians to get their own state, and Jews still to have Israel as a Jewish state and still to feel safe and comfortable. Luckily, the hard work was already negotiated in the 1995 Oslo Accords. It's a very viable option, but every single time Israel continuously like builds settlements, it radicalizes Palestinians further, which makes them more likely to vote for Hamas, which radicalizes Israelis further, making them more likely to vote for Netanyahu, and we get further and further away. Every single time, we're now in a situation where, like Jerusalem's such a good example, where there's now so many settlements in East Jerusalem of Jews that you would now have to, in order to give East Jerusalem to the Palestinians, which is what a 2-state solution requires, where you kind of divide the city, it's not really possible because you would have to ethnically cleanse all the Jews out of East Jerusalem. So now the only option for East Jerusalem is to create somewhat of like an international zone, at least in the old city. So it's like, and if this problem continues and it goes into, say, like the West Bank and becomes bigger and bigger, it's just going to get further and further away. And at some point, it's just going to lead to Palestinians having no recourse and just having to basically give up their play. So yeah, I think this two-state solution is very, very important to be focusing on.
Okay, open the general discussion. Anyone?
So everyone agrees with me, right? Like that's
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think what you were saying definitely makes sense, especially when it comes to, radicalization of Palestinians, which is something I know Azikruth and Sam both mentioned. I'm not sure what it was, but Sam, I think your point is really interesting because you're talking about the radicalization of both sides, which I think is important. And I think that's something we saw from the elections in March. There was, can't remember the name of the party, but there's a very far right party in that recently gained seats in the March 2021 elections. By the way, not the only 2021 elections, because there's another in June. Keep in mind, totally functional government, by the way. But the thing going on with that is that they gained 2 more seats, I think, and they're now at 4. And they have roots in a much older party in Israel, which is extremely far right and is basically was straight up yes, we are advocating for wiping out just all the Palestinians. So there's certainly radicalization on both sides, and we really need to attack that. So I think that point from Sam is really important. That it's not just the radicalization of Palestinians and supporting Hamas and supporting more violent measures to maintain land. It's also radicalization of the Israelis who are moving further right. The young in Israel are also very right wing. So yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things here I think is kind of important is that every time, for example, Hamas builds rockets, more Israeli Hamas shoots rockets and builds rockets, the more often when more Israelis lose hope that a peaceful solution is possible. And every time that there's more settlements or whatever, then the same thing happens with Palestinians, and it's kind of a very bad cycle. I think right now that basically Hamas is Netanyahu's best friend electorally, because it shores up his base, because Hamas firing their rockets, right, responding in the way that they responded, right, acting in the way that they act, drives people into drives people away from any sort of thought that peace is possible. I think there was what was it? There were parties, I think, before in the prior elections in Israel that championed, let's try to go for peace again, and those parties are getting less and less electorally right now. And the same thing in the Palestinian territories in Gaza, with Mahmoud Abbas canceling the elections because guess what? His polling numbers are going down. And now basically what you have is Hamas, who is acting in a way that they want to say, well, hello, we're leading the Palestinians, right? We're leading the Palestinians, and Netanyahu is electorally incentivized to simply do nothing, right? Or not even make the situation any better, because that shores up his base, and Hamas is incentivized to act even worse because that shores up their base, in any sort of potential Palestinian elections, which should have been held this year, should have been held 10 years ago, and have been constantly put off. Whenever there's some sort of thing to peace, there's always something that comes up. There's always there's Netanyahu's party, and so this is kind of a cycle of radicalization. And and I think this I was talking with members of my family about this, and a story that I think can also be relatable is there was a story about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and my family, right, we're on my father's side, we're not we're unionists, right? And so there were situations where there was parties or get-togethers at factories and factories, right? And you weren't supposed to take pictures, right? And there was one girl that was taking pictures, and one of the people at the plant was wearing a shirt, right? A shirt with one of the volunteer regiments or whatever, and looked very innocuous, looked whatever. And the guy ended up on a bunch of hit lists. And what my great aunt said, right, was that they knew, right, that not all Catholics, right, were bad, right? Not all Catholics were IRA. Not all Catholics wanted to put, just regular members of the community that aren't part of any organization on hit lists, but they don't know which ones, right? But they don't know which ones, and they don't know if it's just somebody on the street. And this is the type of, like, every time somebody's on a hit list and somebody gets shot or some rocket gets fired, it ingrains that mentality of, well, we don't know who to trust on the other side, and it radicalizes people further, and it drives people to, like, these radical parties who just want to wipe out all Palestinians, right? And then it drives people into the arms of Hamas.
It's not just violence that radicalizes people, right? It's also breaking the peace treaties that were agreed upon in the 1995 Oslo Accords. Like, there were commitments that were made by the Israelis at the time in order to facilitate that future peace of the two-state solution. And Israel, and ever since Likud took control, Israel has regularly and continuously built more and more settlements, and just increased the amount of settlements, or facilitated other organizations building settlements. So which keeps the two-state solution further and further away. So every single time that, like, I understand the argument that Israel concerned about pulling out the occupation right now, while Palestinians are very radicalized, supporting a group like Hamas that is genocidal in its doctrine, right? I get that, but there's no excuse to be building settlements. Like, you can't tell me that building settlements is useful in a security way, because it actually does the exact opposite. It causes a lot more money to be spent for the IDF. And it causes huge headaches for the IDF to be protecting these Jewish settlers in the region, and just causes a lot of violence in the region. So, like, why are they continuously supporting this? And the reason why they're supporting this is because of Likud's reliance on the religious parties within Israel. And this is just growing. You guys are talking about that Israelis are becoming more and more radicalized. It's actually not really true. As a large demographic, they technically are. But what's happened is that the religious, the Orthodox, or what we call in Israel the Haredi, have been growing and growing, because they have way more kids. Like, they literally, a small family in an Orthodox family is like 7 or 8. And they've been migrating on much higher rates, right? So just like, especially as Zoomers have now come of age, they've just become way more of a bigger population in Israel, and have a lot more control. And Likud and Netanyahu is willing, in order to keep his power, is willing to make these coalitions regularly with these religious parties that lead to even situations where, like, Jews have less rights. Just because they're not religious. Like, as a Jewish woman, I'm not allowed to get divorced unless my husband agrees to it in Israel. And that's because of an agreement that's made with the religious parties. So it's like, there's that problem that needs to be resolved as well.
Yeah, and there's also the idea, like, the fact that, like, Trump actually radicalized Israel a little bit, right, with the stopping of with moving the embassy to Jerusalem, or saying he was going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, right? This is something that we knew was going to happen. That's why we've been delaying it since 1995, when we first recognized that Israel wanted Jerusalem to be their capital, and said that we would move our embassy there, right, in 1995. We've delayed that every 6 months. We delayed that, and Trump was the first president to not delay it, and that definitely led or has some effect on what's happening today, right? It empowers Israel to have these settlements that, like, I think everybody here says, would agree that they're not proper, or they're not even, like, legal, right?
Well, he did more than not delay it. Like, he, I think when he first did that, he applied some pressure there, and he's also gotten other countries to recognize it, like Kosovo and some other country. Can't remember the name of the other European country, but now we have 2 European allies who also recognize Jerusalem as the capital. It's pushed for that. So that is definitely a factor. Although I do think it is hard to have a sort of solution there. At least a 2-state solution, which we are all in favor of. I think it's hard to get that without recognizing Jerusalem as the capital. At least West Jerusalem, the part that has always been internationally recognized as Israel's. Of course, East Jerusalem is not. But
I don't think Palestinians are going to accept their own state without Jerusalem as their capital as well. So just inevitably, what needs to happen is West Jerusalem needs to become the Israeli capital. East Jerusalem, at least certain portions of East Jerusalem, need to become the Palestinian capital. And obviously, there would be like a highway that would connect between Gaza and the West Bank. And that was like the original viable solution.
Do you think that the idea of like taking Jerusalem and like the surrounding area and turning it into kind of like a Vatican UN is like impossible, or do you think that that's like just because everybody wants like Jerusalem to be their capital?
No, I don't think that Israel is going to agree to that, because Israel has huge trust issues with the UN, and I think they have good reason to. If you look at the way, keep in mind, like there's a lot of problems in the UN with specific powers having control and their influences, and sometimes it turns out in Israel's favor, sometimes it doesn't. It's very rarely in some kind of like objective morality lens. So I totally understand why they would not trust these really special holy sites and all of that stuff and put that into the control of the UN. What I would think that could happen, right, is that you would have like West Jerusalem under Israeli control, East Jerusalem under Palestinian control, and then some kind of international like zone where it's like with the old city. And that would be where you would have, say, like a country like Norway or something, some kind of like a country that are, I guess, would be considered universal peacekeepers that both the Palestinians and the Israelis have agreed to. I think this is done in Bosnia or something. I'm not really sure. And so it's not actually like an international city run by the UN, but those peacekeepers are there to just make sure that both parties are able to worship fairly, right? Because there's just, right now, the situation right now is just totally unviable. The Muslims feel like they are constantly being restricted at Al-Aqsa Mosque and at the Dome of the Rock. And on top of that, Jews are not allowed to even go pray on the actual Temple Mount. Like I'm not allowed to even go there as a Jewish person because of Israel's very real fears of violence breaking out on the Temple Mount. So
yeah,
it's just shitty.
There is a thing of like Israel does have good reasons not to trust the United Nations, especially considering like the way the UN has treated Israel. But I also don't necessarily think that it would be hopeful to hope for international control of Jerusalem, but I don't necessarily think that it's viable or that anybody currently is going to be willing to accept it. It's the status quo, I think they call it, is I wouldn't say the most stable thing, but I think it is the Russian position that East Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine and West Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. I think that's how they recognize it. I think it's the only country, one of the only countries that does that. But I don't think that long term, I wouldn't say long term viability of that proposal. If it could work, it might, but I don't think that either the electoral politics or just the way that people feel about these sites is going to work out that way, because there are still massive unresolved disputes about land and who owns what and all this other stuff that we've literally just seen in it's what precipitated the whole stuff in Sheikh Jarrah. And I think it's there's much more there's a lot of complications to re-separating out the cities, especially with the current situation of where people live. And
there are complications. There would have to be negotiations.
Yeah, and I don't think that until there are parties within the parties that aren't willing to compromise have to be gotten rid of, and the parties that are militantly want to just genocide people have to be gotten rid of before any of those things are even remotely possible, pragmatically achievable, what I mean. So it's it would be it's an interesting idea, and I also think that I think the international community could probably look to Bosnia, where as a potential what can happen, where they have the country of Bosnia-Herzegovina is divided into two sections, the Republika Srpska, right, which is where the Serbian state within it, and then there's the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina kind of like complicated, which is like the Bosnian state. And they're kind of like, there's like this joint presidency and all this other stuff. And I think that might be like something to look at as people negotiate that. But like, I guess that's where I was going there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea of having, international control in Jerusalem to protect, both religions and making sure both religions can worship is a good idea, but I'm not sure how that would be possible, because while I understand Israel's concerns with like the UN not being impartial, I mean, of course, there's like a laundry list of security resolutions about occupations of certain lands that have happened since like 68 to now. But I feel like, there would be a lot of problems with that on the Palestinian side. Like, even if we were to hypothetically say that we don't have Hamas or the PLO in power, and we have a moderate group, if we were to have a different international group, like say NATO, I think Palestine would say, hey, I have a feeling these won't be impartial, because if you think about it, NATO is really just an arm of the US military. And the US is, of course, very, very biased in favor of Israel. So I don't know like how you find like an international group or even in a country that would be super impartial. I guess Russia would be the best, since you
volunteer as tribute. No, Russia would never. Russia would have to be one of the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah, no, Russia wouldn't do that. I think it's
Russia's got a really dark past with Israel-Palestine, very dark. So yeah, I would not get them involved.
I want to know what other countries also recognize those two, both East and West Jerusalem, as Israeli and Palestinian capitals, respectively. Is there a Scandinavian country that does that? Because I guess that would be probably the best.
I mean, we'd also have to see if like a Scandinavian country could be willing to do that. If not right now, right? Like that's another option we could do.
So, I wanted to ask, Askareth, you brought up the response, right, of Hamas with the rockets. Because, in your opinion, right, how were the Palestinians supposed to respond to the recent provocations? Like, what would, in your world, what would have been the best way of doing that?
Not with indiscriminate strikes against civilians. The only reason why the casualties aren't like severely higher and disproportionate, like, against civilians, against an organization that doesn't care how many of its own people die, so long as they get to kill a few Jews, right? Like not throwing rockets at highly populated civilian sectors. When you're talking about and so that there's an issue of like, well, there's issues, right, with so what was the alleged what was like the alleged situation that like the official situation that prompted Gaza to just fire rockets? Oh, it was because in Al-Aqsa, I think it was Al-Aqsa, right?
Yeah, it was the Al-Aqsa monster.
It was the
Al-Aqsa
event, right? And so there was a very spicy event with Israeli police and people in people on the Temple Mount, and I don't think that effectively very, very spicy with like riot squads, forcing people out of a place of worship. But I don't think either a proportional or a rational or even a moral response to it is to fire rockets intended to kill thousands of rockets intended to kill thousands of civilians into highly populated urban areas. That's just it's a question of like, well, what do you do? How'd you do it? Well, what you do is this is a civilian problem, right, with civilian court systems, and that's how you deal with it. You work through you work through the proper processes. You don't effectively engage in like a military campaign intended not to like target the Jerusalem police, right? Not to boycott the Jerusalem police, right? Not to like or do something when it comes to like the authorities, right? you target, you specifically try to kill civilian population, and I think that's a type of escalation that is simply unacceptable. I don't think in any moral world is that ever acceptable to like escalate to that to that degree. Sure. Especially when you then make, especially when you then yeah. So like the only reason that there aren't even higher casualties is because Israel was forced to develop the Iron Dome.
Okay, but I mean, obviously, like, I understand that if Hamas had the power to wipe out Israel, like, it would do that, right? Like, we all get that. Hamas is really bad. The thing is that it's still a completely disproportionate response. So yeah, rockets are being sent, but they're being sent by Hamas. And for example, like, not all Palestinians support Hamas, and even the Palestinians who do support Hamas, their only other option is Fatah, right, which is a corrupt party, right? So it's like, it's hard for me to even say, like, if I understand why Palestinians, even if they disagree with the militant aspect of Hamas, right, like, they can agree with the other aspects of Hamas, or because they're not, like, they're not as corrupt as Fatah. They're not exactly given the greatest options in Gaza. So it doesn't make sense to me, especially, and I know Israel has the power. Like, we've seen the way the Mossad has targeted Iranian nuclear scientists and stuff. Like, they can totally take Hamas officials out in very targeted ways that will leave almost no civilians dead. Like, the reason why they're doing these bombings is purposely to punish Palestinians as a whole, right? It's collective punishment as a way to wreak economic devastation. And I know they go on like, oh, like, we dropped the leaflets, and so it's like we're not killing as many people. But first of all, they still end up killing people. A lot of children who never even got a chance to decide whether or not they're going to support Hamas. And then on top of that, like, we know that they're destroying these buildings. And I do think there's also a really good reason to think that Israel never ever intended on accepting a ceasefire on day 1 or day 2, that they had actually already planned to kind of their next attack on Gaza to bully them with economic devastation, and basically try to force them to submit instead of having to bring them to a diplomatic table. And it's very, very frustrating to watch. It feels like they saw this opportunity with what happened with Al-Aqsa and Hamas setting rockets. They're like, okay, this is our opportunity to go do this. And this is probably why Israel's still waiting a few days until they finish their quote unquote mission before they accept the ceasefire.
So
I mean,
okay, well, we'll go to Sam first, please, Sam.
I think that, like, when we say that there's like a disproportionate like use of force, that is true, but I don't think that, like, that is a major deal, because even if the proportion of force was equal, like, let's say the number of people died on both sides were equal, we would still, like, have the same criticisms. So, like, while it's good to bring this up, I don't know if it's like and it is true. I'm not saying it's not true. It is something that, like, doesn't really change the fact what of what's going on and, like, the effects of what's going on, right?
Ooh, I both really agree and really disagree with that. I mean, I think that's true. We would have a lot of the same criticisms, but I also think a big reason why I partly agree with it is because the thing is, Israel knows where those rockets fired by Hamas were intended to land. Like, I don't think Hamas is just indiscriminately firing rockets into the air and be like, it'll go wherever because the Iron Dome is going to shoot them down. It doesn't matter where they're directed. They know damn well where it's directed, and it's directed towards urban population centers in Israel that would kill a lot of civilians. So Israel's like, okay, we can play that game too. You don't have an Iron Dome, and it kills a lot of civilians. However, I do think that is a huge problem, though, that it is killing a lot of civilians, and that those civilians have zero protection, and they can just, completely raze buildings, in urban parts of Gaza.
Well, yeah, I think that a massive complication in all this is the degree to which Hamas regularly, like, integrates civilian and military infrastructure. I think that, like, what was it, like, one of the, like, other times is, like, they are known to do stuff like set up military bases, like, in hospitals, in order to increase the amount of civilian casualties that will inevitably happen.
Do you know how densely populated Gaza is?
Oh, very.
it's like incredibly dense. Like I'm telling you, there is no place to even set up a Hamas-like organization, right? That, especially when you consider that Hamas is right now like the ruling party. It's the ruling government in there. So basically, like they have three wings of their organization. So of course, like, you know, their social wing is going to be in almost like most zones. It's just like, natural. So I don't understand like why that's even considered an excuse, because it's like you can literally say all of Gaza is Hamas. And that's still incredibly unfair.
Well, no, it's
yeah.
when you're talking about, for example, military and strategic decisions, and you're talking about what is and isn't a military target. When you have like military targets that are integrated within like civilian institutions, you have to have a decision of like, well, do we target those, you know, legitimate military targets, which have been integrated in a way as to maximize civilian casualties? And personally, if you're an organization that purposefully integrates military you know, installations within civilian targets, right? Like your military targets is integrated with like a civilian institution, like to the degree where if a rocket is fired, you know, if a targeted airstrike hits your military installation, right? These civilians will also be targeted. The moral fault in that situation is on the organization which integrates those, not on the one that targets the military installations.
Well, it is on the
Because
fault of Israel when they have the power to be able to do something else. Like when they have other opportunities, they can be targeting Hamas officials specifically, like through assassinations. We know Israel has the power to do this through the Shin Bet. Like they're not just targeting Hamas officials; they're purposely trying to destroy buildings as a whole. Right? They're trying to wreck, like, they're trying to create an economic devastation, like on the people of Gaza. Like that's a fact. That it's pretty. Like, do you not think that they genuinely have that intent?
look, there are concerns, right, when they target entire buildings. Like there's the AP building, right? And I would definitely want to see, for example, the reasoning that, you know, Israel has when targeting that. But to say that, like, you know, what I know about, you know, Hamas, what I think everybody knows about Hamas is that it is not, you know, above them to integrate, you know, their military targets in a way that would, for example, cause Israel to strike it, and then would create furor when the press says X, Y, or Z. But I would still want to see, for example, you know, what's your reasoning behind this? Like, what you know, degree of certainty did you have that, you know, there were actually military installations in those buildings? Because that actually does make a difference. You know, that information, I think, you know, people should pressure them to say, well, you know, leaving stuff out for like national security concerns, what was your like risk analysis based on that? And I think the fact that, you know, they told people to evacuate does them a lot more credit than, you know, people that simply fire rockets into civilian areas. Like when you have like this military, you know, a military conflict, right? You can't just like go, oh, we're just going to start assassinating everybody. I don't think that like when you have, you know, places that are designed to like fire rockets, when you need to like destroy infrastructure, like you need to destroy like command and control centers, which is actually very important. Like if you just kill people, right, like it's kind of like a hydra. You have like a bunch of people that can replace them, but if you like strategic infrastructure is much more difficult to replace than people are. And so like, you know, you've kind of like, you know, Hamas calls, you know, its own leadership, like I think like, you know, a while ago they they executed one of their commanders for allegedly being gay. Personally, I think that it was much more of something like somebody wanted to take the guy's place as a regional commander or whatever. You know, but they are known to do stuff like that. So simply killing people might not neutralize the actual threat. You need to destroy military infrastructure. You know, what's the point in, you know, killing one commander if they still have like 1,000 rockets that like the next guy in charge can fire?
Okay.
What's the point in doing that if like the planning, you know?
Okay.
Yeah, you made a lot of points there, some of which I did want to respond to. Like the idea that, oh, if we just kill this one guy, he'll be replaced. Like you can make this argument with Soleimani. Like someone did replace him who's probably just as bad and was like under his wing for like, what, 2 decades or something? Which I still kind of disagree with. I still think Soleimani was much worse, and like, you know, his commanding power as a general. I think that his successor does not have that same power. I do think it actually did have an impact. But even if you are going to make that argument and validate it, you have to keep in mind there's still only so many people next in line that eventually, if you do this same position 2 or 3 times with UAVs, then you are going to significantly nerf the power of Hamas. And I looked up if the IDF has UAVs. There is one they have. It's called the IAI Haran. And this was part of a purchase on September 11th of 2005, where the IDF purchased $50 million worth of Haran systems. So the IDF has access to multiple of this system, and that's just a portion of its UAV capacity, keep in mind. So the IDF's Air Force does have access to UAVs. They can target people specifically, so I'm going to have to side with Eris on that. And then you also mentioned the building they recently shot down that had, I think AP and Al Jazeera. Like, yes, it did have those, but what they did there was much more correct than what they ever do with any hospital or any school they shoot down in Gaza. They'll just shoot it down and say, oh, human shields, they're using kids, they're using doctors as human shields, which is just not defensible when we see what they did with this building. They literally dropped leaflets. They dropped these, I think, warning bombs, which literally just make a loud sound on the roof. They let these institutions know, hey, you need to evacuate this building before we drop a bomb. They never do anything like that with schools or hospitals. They don't drop these leaflets or warning bombs saying, hey, this area needs to be evacuated because we are going to bomb it. They just bomb it. So I don't think the human shields argument is justified when we can clearly see that,
We also have to remember that there is an Israeli propaganda narrative that they have pushed for basically 30 years. Actually, even longer. I mean, Golda Meir was saying this. I think she was quoted as saying in the late 1970s, peace will come when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us. Right? There's always this kind of attitude that they don't value life, that these Muslims, they don't value life the way that we do, and all that stuff. And all that stuff's just totally bullshit. And it's a false narrative that's being spread. So has Hamas participated in human shields in the past? There have been instances, but there's also Hamas is the official government of Gaza. They are going to be in almost every zone, and Israel has to be prepared for that. And they do have tools to be able to handle that. So it's when they have plenty of options in order to reduce the amount of terror that's basically happening to Palestinians. And I do think that the numbers do matter. Because I know, Sam, earlier you mentioned that you don't feel that you think if the numbers were more equal, would it be as big of a deal? And I don't think that's necessarily true, right? It's important to demonstrate that Israel is the one with control, with the power in this situation, and the difference in those numbers. I mean, every single one of those numbers leads to another Palestinian life being taken away. And on top of all those numbers, a lot of people don't even realize is all just the economic devastation and the health devastation that it does to Palestinians, limbs being torn off, all of that stuff, and what it does to their families and the effects of that. It basically sows the seeds for new radicalization. Every single time someone's injured, their family becomes more radicalized, their neighborhood becomes more radicalized, etc. And all that does is it leads to Israelis actually being less safe. So to me, it doesn't even make sense from a military perspective or a self-defense perspective why they're engaging this. What it does make sense to me is that when they engage in this stuff, it makes Israelis feel less safe. So then they vote for Likud more, right? And the people who are deciding whether or not to make these decisions, to what kind of military tactics they're going to use in Gaza, is Netanyahu, right? He's at the control of the helm at the time, so he directly benefits from this, even though Israelis themselves don't. And obviously, Gazans are, have to reap the worst reward out of all of it. So that's what I think is particularly gross.
Sam?
So I wasn't saying that like it wouldn't matter. What I was kind of saying is that like the actions of like hitting these buildings would be something that we could still criticize, and the acts of Hamas like or targeting areas of like high civilians would still be something that we can criticize. That it's not the body count that is the like the biggest issue, right? It is an issue, and I'm not saying that it isn't. And I 100% agree that it shows the position that Israel is in compared to Palestine, and we need to take that into consideration. But the argument that like targeting the AP building, right, is something that actually helps radicalize these people. One, it helps the narrative that Israel is trying to just destroy media and any media criticism of them, right? Mm-hmm. That's something that can be spread because now they've targeted it literally it writes itself, right? Israel attacks Al Jazeera and AP to stop criticism of their attacks on Palestine. That's the headline, right? It further radicalizes people in Palestine. And just like you said, Eris, when they say, "Oh, Hamas was actually in that building," using these human shields, it further scares Israelis and makes them radicalized as well. So this is like furthering the narrative that I was bringing earlier. That it's just like the actions themselves are what we can criticize, right?
So I wanted to ask as well. And you're already going that direction. Do we believe the Israeli military when they say like all these bombing sites? Oh yeah, Hamas is definitely 100% in there, 100%. Do you believe that?
I don't. That was actually something I wanted to respond to. Is that the radicalization point that Eris was making, which I think is very true. I think. We have like 2 or 3 documented incidences of human shields. And so the IDF has just kind of like literally glued itself to that argument, be like, oh, human shields, human shields, human shields. And whenever, because no one's going to immediately provide that much pushback. I mean, they're going to say, how do you know that? And they'll bring up these 2 or 3 instances. But I think that just because we have these documented instances doesn't mean every single time that Israel bombs a hospital or a school, that's Hamas using human shields. I don't think that's the case. So, yeah, I don't think it's consistently happening.
Okay.
I just actually do want to call out though. There was someone who was like defending Hamas in chat, and I feel like you guys should do something about that. They were saying that Hamas is just defending what's theirs, right? Which is a really, really gross statement. So, yeah.
Okay. So we're gonna have actually one other person join us, a mod from my channel, a Jewish individual. We'll get it right this time. Anyway, try. But one of the others, sorry about that, Ashcroft. I made an assumption, and that was my fault. When we had that previous discussion. But thanks for joining us here. I'm glad you're with us in any which way. Okay.
Yeah, I'm the other Orthodox.
Okay. Well, fair enough. I do have a question for you, and I don't feel like it was answered. That my previous question for you. I don't think it was actually answered satisfactorily. So I'm going to ask you again. How should the Palestinians respond? Right? So you're saying, well, not with rockets. Okay, good. We got that. All right. Don't respond by bombing. Okay, sure. But go through civilian proper channels. What are these channels that they can utilize, right? So as I understand it, and anyone correct me if I'm wrong, right? So as I understand it, part of the provocation for these current problems comes from the evictions that were happening in this one residential area, right? And the Israeli courts say that these Jewish individuals, Jewish landlords, have the right to do so, right? Like they own this land. Palestinians dispute that, right? But once again, they are not believed. Their documents are not even looked at, and they're being tossed off. So how would you respond?
Well, to my understanding, right, the whole dispute, the whole reason that the courts or anybody has like the justification to evict these people is because back in like when Israel first took control of East Jerusalem, right, the previous owners, there was like a law passed saying that you can try to get, if the nobody holds the title deed right to the land, you can get that land back. And the courts came down on the side of these Palestinians that were living there, saying that they are protected tenants, and that because Jordan hadn't transferred over ownership of the land to them, right, after Jordan annexed the West Bank, because Jordan didn't officially transfer ownership to them, the chain of custody of the land stays with the people that were there before, but you can't evict them if they keep paying rent, and then they simply refuse to, pay rent for 30 years. Which, I mean, you get into kind of very complicated areas where, like, well, you have a family who has been living there for, nigh on 60 years, right? And but like, to my understanding, a lot of it was like, these people had agreed to like a judicial settlement where they're recognized by this protected tenant status, so long as they pay the rent. But then the intifadas happened and people stopped paying rent, and so there's that level. Whether or not like there should be some sort of consideration of the fact, I do think people should probably consider the fact that these people have been living there for like ages, and that originally they were people that have been.
Sorry, which people? You're saying people. I don't know which people.
So the families that are being evicted.
Okay.
Right. So like that they have lived there, and these are people that have been that were caught up in the Palestinians. Okay. Yeah, the Palestinian families that are being evicted. Mm-hmm. I believe originally were from West Jerusalem, but then the euphemistically termed population exchange happened. They ended up in that region, but nobody ever bothered to properly give them the title deed to the land, which is what gave people the in to claim the land back, right? Which in no small part is the fault of Jordan, because I'm not certain. I did hear somewhere that like there were other families that did that obtained the proper title deed from Jordan that aren't being evicted because the Israeli courts recognized that was a proper chain of custody.
If you could give us a source for that I would actually really that some families aren't being evicted.
I can try to I can try to find
it. Just to be clear, the Sheikh Jarrah thing has been totally misunderstood, like by the media,
okay,
and by like a lot of people. So like I at first, when I first read about it, it sounded like ethnic cleansing. And Israel has participated in ethnic cleansing in the past, so I wasn't like surprised. But yeah, when you actually look into the situation, that specific area had actually been owned by Jews before 1948. And when Jordan actually took over the region as a result of the 1948 war, the Jews there were ethnically cleansed, were forced to leave, and they naturally moved to Israel. So they've been charging, I guess, the Palestinians rent, and then those specific Palestinian families were not paying their rent, right, like on time or something, and that's like why it got taken to court.
No, they weren't paying rent at all, I think.
Okay, I'm pretty sure like eventually like they originally were paying rent and they eventually stopped, right? But yeah, it didn't happen to all the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah or anything. It was like a few specific families, like a few specific houses.
Okay.
But I understand why Palestinians were really sensitive about it, and it was really stupid for Israel to even like in general, to me, like I think it's really, really stupid to like look at, say, families that are there right now and to punish them for something that happened 73 years ago. So, right, like this is like that kind of thinking is exactly what led us into this entire crisis itself, and yeah, it's why I don't like land reallocations anywhere. It's like, yeah, it could cause like a lot of problems, and obviously where it's not like we're like reallocating land back to Arabs that Israeli stole. So it's just like super unfair. So I could understand why Palestinians were really upset about it.
Yeah. I mean, also like the situation is complicated. Because I think eventually the land got sold to like these trusts, right? So like these legal persons and not natural persons. And so like I'm less sympathetic to like legal persons than I am to like the natural persons that actually live there. I mean, I think that like, so it's like, these are like human people that live there, whereas it's kind of just like vague companies that now own the land because the chain of custody of the land has been like sold or whatever, because the original people that would have kind of like reclaimed their homes after 1967 kind of like were like, oh, okay, well, there was this court judgment. They're protected tenants. We're kind of not getting our homes back, so I guess we'll just sell the land deed to somebody that just wants to collect rent, and I'll kind of actually get a house, right, with that money, right? And so like, at this point, I'm kind of like there should be some consideration given to the fact that these people have lived there for 60 years, and the fact that the original owners of the homes don't own the property anymore. Like the people that would like actually have like the sympathetic claim to the territory, but like that complicates a lot of the situations. But but also kind of legally speaking, I don't think that this like kind of qualifies as specifically like an ethnic cleansing thing, specifically, especially because like this has been like an ongoing like dispute, and the reason that they're being kicked out, like if these people were to have like paid their rent, right, none of this, like they would have had zero justification. And the protests begun like before the Israeli Supreme Court even heard the case, right? So I don't even think the Supreme Court has given judgment yet.
Do you think,
right?
And then after this, I'm gonna let in our we're gonna let in our newest guest. But hey, hi. Do you think that Palestinians, just in general, so let's stipulate that literally everything you have said is correct, right? Let's say that it is as you say, and then it's even the fault of the tenants, which I'm not able to stipulate yet, but let's say that is the case. Should Palestinians
okay, so I'm sorry.
Let me
finish.
Yes, right. Finish my words, please. Should Palestinians ever have any faith in the Israeli civil justice system, considering their history, right? So, should they? Because that's kind of the heart of this matter, right? When you're talking about using these civilian routes, is that you have to have faith in these institutions. Should these Palestinians have faith in these institutions?
They have very good reason not to.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Eris.
No, they have very good reason not to. The Israeli courts, just like in the United States, the way the American justice system has like a bunch of systemic issues against Black people. In the Israeli court system, there's like a very similar problem with discrimination against Arabs, and just anyone who doesn't fit, the people who are normally the ones in power, in those regions. So. There's very good reason. I understand why Palestinians didn't accept it. I've read through the court rulings and it makes sense, but I still think it was a really unfair decision. And it certainly was unfair to the Palestinians' families that were in that region. I think you asked a question earlier, Prime, about what other alternative do Palestinians have when they are feeling oppressed, and when they want to fight back. And I would say, right, the alternative, I'm trying to think what am I allowed to say with TOS, right? But the alternative, there are plenty of other options besides indiscriminately targeting civilians. So there have been many they're not the first oppressed group in history, though I know that never makes the oppression seem smaller to the people who are experiencing it. But there have been some amazing Palestinians that have done great things, from boycott movements to, to being, I mean, they're the most heavily educated population in the entire world per capita. I think that does a lot of power by moving and changing people's minds in universities and everything. And also just trying to reform Fatah. There's also a movement, a lot of people don't talk about this, there is a reformist movement within Hamas itself, that they still, I guess, connect to some aspects ideologically with Hamas in terms of their Muslim ideology and that, but they disagree with the anti-Semitism parts. So there is a potential for like Hamas to actually reform itself, similar to how Fatah originally reformed itself. The PLO used to support terrorism, right? The PLO used to, support a lot of genocidal stuff against Jews. They've completely changed their tune, and now they're recognized and legitimized. So I do think that Hamas has the opportunity to potentially do that. So we shouldn't just completely write them off. But yeah, the answer is just never indiscriminately targeting civilians. If they want to throw a rock at at a soldier, I mean, that's, I guess, war, right? So I'm not really sure what I'm allowed to say with Discord TOS. With Twitch TOS. So I get that, right? Like, that stuff is war, and but there are laws of war, and just as it's really gross when Israel regularly, and still it does this a lot still, when it commits war crimes, or when it uses white phosphorus or something like that, like targeting civilians or being indiscriminate with your violence is also a war crime. So we shouldn't just say oh, that's okay because of what they're going through. I don't think that that's ever okay, especially when we actively know that it causes more harm to Palestinians in the long run.
Okay, I'm gonna let in our newest friend, newest handsome friend, Socrates, back at it. Thank you for being here, buddy.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I'm gonna bring everything that I've got. I had some dental work done earlier, and I was streaming for 5 hours, playing League and talking about Israel. So I'll try to bring whatever semblance of my shattered brain back together for this conversation.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm glad to be here, and what appears to be pretty serious conversation. I'm trying to lurk and try to get on the same page in terms of where exactly the conversation is now and kind of where it's going. Happy to be here, give my perspective.
Sure. Well, the original question, and we've long moved past it, but that's okay. The original question, as soon as I pull it up, is holy shit. So when it comes to possible solutions, are you in favor of a single state or a two-state solution, or possibly a three-state solution where Jerusalem becomes its own state similar to the Vatican? So that's where we started, and then we shifted into the various contours of the conflict, the current specific troubles that are happening, and the source of those, and then why the response is what it is, and stuff like that. So first of all, I'll start with that topic. Are you in favor of a two-state, single state, two-state, or a three-state solution? And we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. So I can give kind of a brief intro.
Sure. Go ahead, please.
To that, which is basically that. I think there's some good reasons to want a one-state solution. That I can understand why that could be desirable for multiple groups of people, for Israeli citizens, for Palestinians. It doesn't seem like something that is politically feasible. So if you think about what it means for there to be a single state, if it's going to be a kind of like a liberal democracy in which everybody has a vote, and it's not like a Jewish ethno state or theocracy or something, then what that means is that Arabs have equal voting rights, and Jews will become a minority. It'll cease to become a Jewish state. So there's really no way that Israel will ever accept something like that, which brings us to a two-state solution. So two states would be basically the kind of common conception is Israel and Palestine within the 1967 borders, according to the UN Resolution 242, which basically says that Israel withdraws from the West Bank, gives the West Bank and Gaza autonomy. They become a state. There's some kind of logistical complications in terms of, obviously, West Bank and Gaza are not adjacent, so there has to be some kind of ability to have transportation across, maybe some kind of like highway that's allowed between those two areas. And the other big complication, of course, the elephant in the room is the settlements. But that those original, very old UN resolutions that talk about the withdrawal of Israeli settlers and troops and control from occupied territories already had a provision in place, which basically is land swaps. So you have lots and lots of Israeli settlements. There's like 650,000 or more Israelis living in these illegal settlements on occupied territories in West Bank. Uprooting all of them is difficult. What's less difficult is to uproot some of them and kind of make up the difference in land that's been taken over by these Israeli settlements with land swaps back kind of onto the Israeli side of the 1967 border. And that's how you have a contiguous Palestinian state that basically is fair based on resolutions that have been put out by the UN, very, very high level of support across the UN, and have been agreed to multiple times by different Israeli and Palestinian governments. So that's my kind of basic approach to when it comes to one state, two state.
Okay.
And Shadows, I don't know if you want to respond to me. If you do,
I did. I had a response, but it also made me think of something great. So I guess your response to that is I feel like there's another elephant in the room. Your first point, which was not the elephant in the room, was like the separation of Gaza and the West Bank. But I think the other elephant in the room is the more, not just a geographical one. I think there is, we do need to find a way for these areas to connect, usually like via highway or something like that. But there's also the political separation. We have the West Bank has the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, in power versus Hamas. And of course, the PLO used to look something similar.
Fatah, it's not the PLO anymore.
So it's not the PLO?
No, the PLO became the Fatah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Obviously, it used to look a lot Fatah, to use the proper name, thank you, Eris, used to look a lot more like Hamas, but it has reformed, like you mentioned. It does not support terrorism. It does not have, like the eradication of all Jews on its, platform. It is a lot more moderate, and it looks to achieve a more reasonable solution, or achieve a solution to this issue via more reasonable means. And then you also mentioned like partially removing some settlements, which reminded me, I believe, and Eris, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I do believe in 2005, when they evacuated the settlements in the Gaza Strip, they did also, I believe, remove the buildings, raise the actual settlement, physical settlements themselves. And I was wondering, if maybe this is a question for the whole panel, if there is a way we could, incrementally do this to some of these settlements in the West Bank, if we think that's possible, to evacuate them and also remove these buildings. And slowly we allow more and more land for there to be Palestinians there, and then for it to be Fatah-controlled land.
Sure. So yes. A couple of responses to that. So first of all, just kind of as a background thing about like, how do you kind of combine forces of like Fatah and Hamas, like, and maybe there's kind of like a question in there, not necessarily specifically from you, but overall, like, why are people in Gaza so radicalized? Why do they support Hamas? Why are they willing to resort to terrorist tactics? And if you look at just the basic bare bones, like objective facts that are totally inarguable about Gaza, there's an unemployment rate above 40%. Life expectancy is horrendous. Most of the drinking water is not fit for human consumption. It's really, really, really terrible conditions there that are unimaginable. And it's been called, for good reason, the world's largest open-air prison, with, I think, 3 million people kind of crammed into this tiny area that's like like a couple kilometers by 12 kilometers, something like that. It's tiny. So there's and it's been heavily blockaded by Israel, so that humanitarian aid can't get through. There's very little electricity. So I think if Israel were to stop blockading and bombing Gaza, I think you would see the level of kind of extremism or support for extremism, or willing to carry out acts of extremism. I think you'll see that kind of thing plummet very, very rapidly as people's just like lives have some ray of hope other than violence. So that's my you know, that's not exactly kind of how you phrase that, but that seemed like kind of an appropriate response to that question of these different authorities. In terms of the support among Palestinians for there to be a contiguous kind of Gaza and West Bank as one Palestinian state, I believe that's pretty high. That's, I'm sure, a poll number somebody could find. And then I'm sorry, I forget what the second part of your question was. Could the settlements be kind of dismantled slowly? Could that be kind of a process that could happen over time?
Yeah, in the manner that they were removed in the Gazan settlements were removed in 2005. Could that be an incrementalist approach to fixing the much larger amount of settlements in the West Bank? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that absolutely could be done with some kind of timetable. What I would love to see, and what I think as the American people we can put pressure on our government to do, would be something like pressure Biden to put terms on military aid to Israel. And those terms could be not even the kind of stretch of end the occupation and allow for Palestinian statehood. That's a messy, complex, easy to spin in lots of ways kind of issue. What we could ask for is something like no new settlements. That's something that will put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu to kind of, it'll divide himself from his base a lot if he stops building new settlements. That's something that could get the ball rolling in that direction. Yeah.
I love that point. I want to respond to that. I think that's great, the idea of, trying to undo settlements, like forcing a timetable. I don't think the U.S. could pressure that. I think that's very correct. But I do think that idea of, making aid conditional to no new settlements, or perhaps saying no new settlements, or else we will reverse our recognition of Jerusalem as the capital. I feel like that would probably be a bit messier. But I do feel like the recognition of Jerusalem as a capital is a viable tool when we come to the table with Israel. But I do like that idea. I think the issue there, though, is that with the disillusion of the blue and white coalition, I feel like there's really not. I feel like that's kind of like Netanyahu's only resort, is to run to the right for more support and kind of shore up his base without that coalition. So I think it's a question of how possible is it to get that back, which I would love to get Eris's take on, because you are, of course, born in Israel, and you
Sorry, what was the question?
It was about the blue and white coalition, which dissolved. Do you think that what is the chance of bringing that back, or something like that back, so now it doesn't have to run to the right for support?
I thought there was a good chance of something like that forming again, or other alternatives before this conflict. But after what's happened in the last week, I'm a bit more doomer about it. So I feel like that's less and less likely right now.
On this, sorry, I kind of going off this. What do we think about like what Biden did today, where he made a formal announcement saying that he is expecting that Israel de-escalates their violence, right? So this is kind of like, I think it's very vague, like what he was doing. But but do you think that like this adds anything to like the global like conversation about it, or no?
Well, it's a deal that they've made. Like they got Israel to agree that they got Israel to agree to a ceasefire, basically, right? The reason why they haven't officially announced that there's going to be a ceasefire is because basically Israel has, as I mentioned earlier, they've probably had this plan in the works to cause this economic devastation to Gaza and to Hamas. So they already have a military plan that they're going forth, and once that's finished, then they'll agree to the ceasefire, right? And so it's like, yeah, so it's kind of like a fake ceasefire, you know? I mean, I'm sure once the ceasefire is like actually happens, I'm sure that's legit. But it's not like they're coming at it like honestly. It's not like they're like, oh, like just wait a little. Like we're thinking about it. It's not that they're thinking about it. They know exactly when they're going to agree to it and everything. They're just waiting until they kill the people they need to kill and destroy the buildings they need to destroy.
So you think like Biden's influence is like nothing here, or do you think that that it did help or not? Because I don't know. I feel like it did. I don't know.
Well, I feel like it does, but I was going to say yes, but in a very nuanced way, because while he did say that, Netanyahu, I believe, also said something about how he plans to finish the operations in Gaza. So I feel like the impact it has is more nuanced in the sense that I think maybe there's some stuff behind closed doors that I think Biden's administration believes that this press announcement will imply that might, help ease the situation. But, I think I can't know that. I think no one does, because none of us are like, in his administration or like peeking through these closed doors. So it's kind of complicated.
I'd be very surprised if he's doing very much of anything to negotiate remotely against any of Israel's interests, military or otherwise. I would be really surprised if he's doing anything whatsoever.
Okay.
He's been very, very staunchly behind Israel since his like early days as a politician, and he's I mean, better than Obama, I guess, who during his term just during those bombings back in 2005 just said like Israel has the right to defend itself over and over again, like ad nauseum. There's some kind of rhetorical benefit to saying we should maybe have less conflict, but it's just such a marginal kind of anything. I don't think anything can be made of it.
Yeah. So first, like I just wanted to like touch on something that we said earlier. I don't think that like a full withdrawal of like what they did in Gaza with the settlements, that is absolutely unviable for anybody. I don't think that's ever going to happen. The political situation on the ground, I think, is such that it just won't, like, it won't happen. It's just not realistic or pragmatic to expect anything upon that level. And I don't necessarily think it's the people that live there. I think a lot of the settlements are there to stay, right? But like having a condition of like no new settlements, right, I think is much more doable, because new settlements are like in a very real way an impediment to the ongoing peace process, right? Like new settlements are, I think the ones that are there, they're like, no, to try to advocate to say, oh no, you have to remove all the settlements, I think is not only a waste of time, but is going to land you with a lot of strange bedfellows that I think a lot of people would rather not have. It's it's just because there are going to be a lot of people that advocate for the removal of the settlements as a method to not only just like to as one stepping stone away to eventually get rid of like all the Jews from the area. Right, like there are people that do that. Like I think that like
sure.
A lot of like a confluence of interest is going to be like very problematic there, alongside the pragmatic consideration of it's just undoable. Like it's just not a achievable goal in any sort of sense. There's way too many people, way too much infrastructure, and politically, electorally, if we're under this situation, like maybe if we lived in like a dictatorship, right, a worldwide dictatorship, and we could just order people and at the barrel of a gun. But Israel is a Western liberal democracy, and at the very if a flawed one that has to like hold elections every few months because they can't form a governing coalition, at the very least, they're a democracy. Like you can't especially when it comes to like these people vote, and I don't think anybody is going to vote for any party that says, oh, by the way, you millions of people, right? Or I think. I think
it's in like the high hundreds of thousands.
Oh yeah, high hundreds of thousands. But even then, they're like a significant electoral bloc, right? Like a non-insignificant, like especially with the electoral dynamics of Israel currently. Just from that perspective, it's undoable, right? Like it's just not something that I think. But new settlements, I think, is a much more achievable thing, especially like just, new settlements I think are an impediment to even a two-state solution, right?
Don't the land swaps help with this kind of idea, right?
But it becomes more difficult to do land swaps if you need more land to swap, right? Like, so if you need to swap less land, right, it's easier to do than if you need to swap more land.
And if the new settlements never ends, then there's the goalpost. Always keeps moving. Just a couple quick reactions. Absolutely intentional. I really like your analysis as a Kreth. When it comes to removing the settlements, Israel as a country doesn't actually have to order these people off the land. If they want to move people out of any settlement, all they have to do is just tell the army not to defend there anymore. That part is actually much simpler from like a logistic kind of political point of view. And obviously your comment about this is a voting block. Absolutely. This is the most conservative, most religious block. Eris, I would love to hear like an in-depth background of the Knesset. I tried to read through some Wikipedia articles of all the different coalitions and try to memorize the different parties. There's a lot. So many. But there's basically like a voting block that's always been like, I don't know what, 5 to 9% or something. That's like more kind of like the settler aligned block. So it's like relatively small, but it's been historically aligned mostly more with the more conservative parties in the Knesset. Mm-hmm. And these are of course the settlers, people aligned with the settlers. So it's not insignificant, but it's also it's something that you have to remember, that this is not like the majority of Israelis love settlements or want to live in settlements or want to protect settlements. This is kind of the way that things have shaken out politically. And through the political system, but this isn't something that's kind of like universally like, oh, all Israelis want to live in settlements or want to build lots more settlements.
Yeah,
which is good. That's fortunate.
You are right. It is like that 5 to 9%, but I would have to. The only area I'd push back is saying that's small, because when it comes to the Knesset and how many parties there are, that is not small. That is very significant. I think something that a lot of I think this is something that a lot of Americans may not realize with having so many different parties in Israel, is that, every single vote counts, especially when creating a coalition, because, when you have so many parties making up, taking up space in the parliamentary system, every single vote counts to certain parties. So making these coalitions is important, and each party knows its base, which is, a big part of the reason why, there are continuation of settlements. I don't feel like, the thing about this is, I don't feel like the Likud party is like that hyphy on trying to expand settlements. I think they're a center-right party. They care more, they're very hawkish on defense. They might, care a lot about maintaining the ethnic white Jewish majority, but I don't think that that's too important to them. But the reason why there is expansion is because of these parties to the right of the Likud that are important for their coalition. They have to agree to it. Otherwise, they, won't be able to maintain power.
The Israel political system, for people that don't know, if a party receives, I think, 3.75% of the vote, they get seats in the Knesset. the Knesset, I pronounced that correctly, right? Knesset,
Mhm.
right? They get seats in the Knesset, right? I mean, it's an example that I like. It's one of the examples why I don't like party list proportional representation, right? But like, I don't know, a lot of people know that like Netanyahu only has like 25% of the vote, yet he's prime minister because he's able to marshal an electoral coalition, right, of all these diverse parties. So even if it's only a couple 100,000 people, those couple 100,000 people could be the difference between, you know, a majority situation or the other coalition getting power, right? Because 3% of the vote can shift the election, right?
Yeah.
Like it's incredibly close, right? Like just, and like, you know, and so just from a realistic standpoint, you know, it is much more feasible to say no new settlements than to say, you know, remove all the settlements, because like regardless of the absolute shit show that it is to resettle everybody, right, from the land that they have occupied in many cases for decades, right? Because there are settlements that go back to
Yeah, there's old ones.
1967, right? There are very old settlements, right? And the oldest one,
Old.
well, yeah, old, but like there is the consideration of that is a consideration. Like it's like, you know, what do you do? Like it's not, you know, I don't think, you know, it's reasonable to just go, yeah, let's just kick everybody off their land. I don't think that's a solution that like anybody but like the most extreme people would like kind of like, if you think about the logistics of it, right? And that's even ignoring, and that's not even going into like the electoral realities or the logistical realities. But no new settlements is a much more achieve like much more realistic.
Yeah, I think we've all agreed on that, or well, we've all agreed on that. So I want to talk about the international response, right? And what you see the role of other nations, maybe even other peoples, but well, let's actually table that. Just focus on other nations. So we'll start with the U.S. Right. So I think Sam brought an interesting question talking about what Biden had said previously. Like there's a rhetorical difference between him and President Obama, and we could just ignore Trump for now. But there's a rhetorical difference between the two. But I think fair enough that it seems like, well, sure, okay, you could say slightly different words on this subject, but it actually accomplishes nothing for anyone. Do you foresee a situation where the U.S. is not, and maybe someone disagrees, but the U.S. is not an impediment to this process? I'm assuming you all agree it's an impediment. If I'm wrong about that, please correct me. But
I don't think
you don't think so.
I think it can be an impediment. Obviously, if there's someone like Trump in control. I also think Obama was an impediment to it because I think that Obama was known to be very bad at negotiating himself. And so like and his public statements often put Israel off. The problem is, like, all we have to go off right now are public statements. And just knowing what I know about like the history of the region, what is said publicly is very different than what's being dealt with privately, what's agreed to privately. So I feel like we're only going to find out in like, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, like about what the Biden administration is really doing. Like for all we know, like they've been really deeply intensive talks and they're doing a lot, right? And for all we know, they might be doing the exact opposite. I didn't like Biden's, I guess, rhetoric on the issue, but at the same time, it might have been strategic as a way to get Israelis to the table to negotiate. So I do think that, and like that the United States has done a lot positively in the past for Israel, Palestine. We always talk about the negative stuff, and there's certainly some negative stuff. But the closest connections that we've ever gone into peace had to do with both American presidents. So I think Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. So those are really, really big moments. And I think that that can totally happen again. The United States is in a very unique position to be able to facilitate peace in the region and to actually have control, at least somewhat control over Israel. And that control is not going to be there for long because Israel's working to become independent of the United States, and it won't be so. It won't have that ability to work that way for a very long time.
Is everyone?
I'm sorry, I totally disagree. I think the U.S. has been an unbelievable impediment to any kind of just resolution. So I just put in the chat.
I'm guessing you're bringing up like UN.
I thought that was me getting time.
I'm guessing you're bringing up like UN, like the votes.
Yeah, exactly right. So this just really long list of so the USA is on the UN Security Council, and again and again there's these kind of unanimous resolutions where like all 15 other countries within the Security Council, or like almost all countries within the UN period, agree on some resolution, and the US vetoes it. So condemning Israeli violence against protesters during the Great March of Return, that was just recently.
Yeah, but that all implies that you think that the UN can actually fix the conflict itself.
Well, so the question is like what to make of the US's response. Has it worked for peace, right? So you had like the Kerry peace plan, whatever. We've had the Camp David talks, and what the description I've heard is that there's never been a peace process. It's always been an annexation process. And the question of like, why does the US support Israel in this way? There's lots of answers. It's kind of overdetermined. Maybe we're just, a settler colonial state, and we kind of are aligned with other settler colonial states that are wiping out their indigenous populations. Maybe we like it strategically. We like having more of kind of a military presence within the Middle East. There's lots of answers to that. But I'm not really sure, compared to these like UN resolution vetoes, like what has the US done to put pressure on Israel? We give them like $4 billion a year of like military aid. I feel like we're just, I don't know that any other.
Keep in mind, the
country
United
has
States is
been
not
a bigger
supporting
impediment
Israel
to progress.
for Israel's sake. It's supporting, or because it's trying to satisfy its Jewish population, or perhaps it's trying to satisfy its Christian population.
there's like infinity reasons. But there's
so
like
it's very useful for them diplomatically. It's the United States version of being imperialist in the 21st century, right? Where they have control over random various nations from like, I don't know, Saudi Arabia to Pakistan to Israel, and has very little to do with like the morality of it. It's just totally strategic. I don't think that the UN there are so many problems with the UN. And I actually think the UN has been a detriment to the peace process historically. So, I mean, the UN basically created the situation. In 1970, was it 1972 or something, when the UN went and made a vote calling, it was an official vote calling Zionism and the belief in the existence of the state of Israel to be racism, right? Yet they didn't make that kind of vote about any other nation that has very, very similar like religious kind of structures in their government.
Okay, so that's like more like, again, kind of on the symbolic side, but in terms of like, so when it came to like the Sinai Peninsula and the Suez Canal, when UN peacekeepers did actually come in and build those like armistice lines, and they did achieve peace. There's now like kind of a relationship between Israel and Egypt. You could argue whether or not it's a result, but I mean that is something that happened. You could argue that those UN peacekeepers coming in did have a positive effect in like real like geopolitical terms.
Well, I don't think, I think they were good at like guarding a peace that was already negotiated. I don't think they were helpful at achieving that peace. That peace was solely on, basically on like the head of like Sadat, the president of Egypt at the time. So I don't like, I think the UN has been like a huge detriment, the way the UN has been a detriment in a lot of ways to like other regions. Like I have a lot of problems with the UN in general. So like to me, it makes sense why the United States has like voted against like favors, like like historically. When I think about, I guess, moments where peace came really, really close. I think of, say, like Camp David, with Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat, where they came very, very close to negotiating peace. You can actually read Bill Clinton's entire description of the negotiations, and they got down to like houses of who was of negotiating houses, and they came very, very, very close to a peace deal. And it's very sad the reason that got kind of thrown away. So I think that the United States actually has like a total viable. They're in a very unique position to be able to, and Americans in general are in a very unique position. So I think like if they put a lot of pressure on their government, on I guess like the Biden government, this is a larger issue, and they want the United States to invest its security of state and everything into trying to solve this conflict, I think it's just like more and more likely.
Yeah, I think the U.S. could do a lot. I just don't think that they have that we have.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Shadows.
Yeah, sorry, I just came back, so I just heard a few points that I wanted to respond to.
And to be fair,
I'll just be right back. I gotta grab some pizza.
Sure. And to catch up, Shadows, I asked the panel, do you think that the U.S. could be anything other than an impediment to the peace process? Eris disagreed with my characterization as the U.S. as an impediment. Socrates agreed, and they were having a back and forth. So go ahead, Shadows.
Oh, okay. So I think that's kind of what I jumped in on, because Eris made a point that there are a multitude of reasons why the U.S. might support it, and I think you mentioned something about religion. I think that is partly true. It's really complicated because it very much depends on the party. So the thing is,
I said that those things weren't real reasons. That like people who think that those are real reasons are like flawed.
Well, I mean, sort of. It is for the Republicans, though, because they care a lot about their evangelical bloc. The thing is,
that's how they sell it politically, but that's not the real reason diplomatically why they do go forth with it.
Right.
Like Israel, the United States has remained steadfast as an ally to Israel, regardless of having Republicans to control or Democrats.
Right.
And it's because it's very strategically useful for them. The same way that even Democrats will go and support their connections, the diplomatic connections to like Saudi Arabia. Even though it's like antithetical to democratic ideals, it's less about politics. It's just more about the actual strategy of the government.
So like I talked earlier. Right.
I think that's true. I would say you're saying it's not political. I think it is, but that's because it's geopolitical. I think there are many geopolitical reasons why. I think that's like the main overlapping reason between Republicans and Democrats having support for Saudi Arabia and other Gulf kingdoms alongside Israel. It's a geopolitical one. They want to ally with these powers. I mean, Saudi Arabia has to do with the military power, but I think they also do it with Israel because they want to be on the side of being against Iran. There's it's very geopolitical in that region. It's like basically Saudi Arabia, Israel, and all the Gulf kingdoms versus Iran. So I think that's a big part of it.
There is a lot. Like I spoke earlier about like countries acting in like what I said is like their own rational self-interest, and a lot of it is like the United States. Democrats or Republicans will support Israel because Israel is like one of the only strategic ally that the U.S. has in the region, right, that acts as like a counterbalance to like a lot of the other regional politics, right? Like especially like when in consideration of Iran, right? Saudi Arabia and Israel form like the bulk of like this defense, not defense, like form like the two poles of like the strategic like the strategy of the United States in the Middle East. They form like the core of it. And so, Republicans and Democrats, it is in like the rational self-interest of the United States to make sure that like Israel is in a position where it is able to like still exist and be an ally of the United States, right? Like that is, both parties. Like, you can say something on the electoral trail, right? You can appeal to, Christian Zionism, which personally I think is a very As a Christian, I don't like it as an ideology. I don't think we should be trying to spearhead the end of the world.
Yeah, I know that.
Right?
That's
Right?
what
Like,
I was.
or at least that's how, like, or at least, you know, and this is like Christian Zionism specifically, like, quote unquote. I believe it's about starting the end of the world, right?
Well, that's what I was kind
right.
of saying about the Republican Party.
I don't think,
is
but like it's not
that
why, right? Like there's yeah, as I said, there's a difference between like what people tell their electorate, right, and like the strategic considerations that are like in the rational self-interest of the country, and it is in the rational self-interest of the United States to support Israel.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just purely that. This is beyond like the fact that you know who countries should support in the region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so it's just like it's beyond electoral politics, and there kind of is a real reason of like there is a faction that simply wants to wipe out an entire population group from the region, and you know, and like peace, like all of the ideas that we've been discussing, that I've been discussing, are more or less predicated on the assumption that like Hamas militancy will no longer be an issue, because peace I don't think is possible with Hamas the way they are at all.
Unarmed Hamas.
You know, so
Asquith.
Is that what you're saying? You don't think peace is possible with an armed Hamas?
Asquith.
Well, unless Hamas like moderates like incredibly as they're in power. But like I think we've seen like, you know, for a lot of organizations that used to be like they come from radical organizations, sometimes or like a lot of the time they moderate the moment they actually have to run a country. We've kind of seen the opposite from Hamas, whereas like since they've like, you know, taken control of Gaza, right, they've misdirected funds, redirected funds that are supposed to like go to building up schools and whatever, and they're building up and they're like building secret tunnels to invade Israel and building rockets and buying rockets. Instead of taking care of their own population. They've actually gotten like more radical since they've become government, and I think that's like you know, so it would be one thing if we're like, okay, we're going to do this peace process, and like the, you know, the PLO moderated into Fatah, right? Right, that didn't happen with, you know, Hamas, which was started as I think the militant wing of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, right? Which is why it's so powerful in Gaza, because way back when it's Egypt that occupied Gaza, right? So, you know, they annexed it for a bit. I think it was a really weird time with the United Arab Republic. But you have that situation, and they've like radicalized even further. So, like this usual historical trend, I don't think like I think is much more unlikely to happen with Hamas than it is with like.
Do you not hear me?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Asquith, you can hear me. Okay, good. All right. So, you said a lot of stuff here. One, is it not true that within Israel, there is a power base, right? For a power base that says that all Palestinians should be wiped off, like the map as well.
Yeah, and they're definitely an impediment to peace. But so far,
all right. No, I just wanted to.
No. Those people are also an impediment to peace,
exactly.
Right? But they're also not the government of Israel,
hold on,
right?
But they are not part of a voting bloc, though. Like
they don't have a you know, a significant chance of becoming
the party
the
you're discussing
government.
Is the Hamas, and they have very little power in the government.
Yeah, like it's not even like
my only point is not that they are in charge. No, I want to make it very clear. Only that this is not like a one-sided thing. There are people, there are groups on both sides who are talking about wiping each other out. So I just want to make that clear, right?
Right. But one of them doesn't like
I
is
don't
not
know,
the government.
Seems like you're both siding this. Like,
well, there you go. I am both siding it, exactly. And furthermore, talking about like taking care of their own people, Hamas taking care of their own people. And this is to everyone. What are their options for taking care of their own people when it seems like they're facing sanctions and and being blockaded?
Well, they're being blockaded because of the stuff with them lobbing rockets, right? Like it's like that is why they're being blockaded, right? It's because you know Hamas is a terrorist organization up until like, it was in their constitution that Israel should be destroyed when they took over and when they started being blockaded, right? Like it's not like, and it happened after like a civil war, right? So it's just like it happened like basically, the elections happened, Hamas won, and then there was like a civil conflict between Fatah and Hamas, and Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, started lobbing rockets, and then all of a sudden, not only Israel is blockading them, but Egypt as well, right? And so there's this real concern that Hamas are not like rational actors, right? And once, Israel withdrew from the territory, right, to give people a chance at peace, and instead Gaza, right, Hamas, right, not Gaza, right, not Palestine, but Hamas specifically took over the territory, took advantage of the fact that there was no IDF, right, and that they were the most militant faction, right, which tends to happen, right, like if you have a militant faction and a less militant faction and there's a military conflict, well, the more militant faction wins, right, where they can, right, in the West Bank they couldn't, right, because there was still some army there, but because Israel completely withdrew from Gaza, Hamas was able to take over there, right? And they decided to be Hamas essentially, and they got blockaded because they were acting in a way.
I hear you. I hear you. Okay, yes, great. I hear you.
And not only by Israel.
Ask guys, please don't talk over me. Right? When you do that, don't just escalate like that. I'm just trying to ask you a question, trying to engage with you, and then the rest of the chat as well, right? And so maybe to the rest, even if it is true, even if it's true that it's simply, well, it's their fault for tossing rockets, but like, what are their options at this point, as world is now, to quote unquote take care of the people? What does that mean? For instance, looking at the COVID pandemic, right? And the great vaccination rates that you see in Israel compared to that in Palestine, is that simply can't import the needed vaccinations. So like, how do they actually take care of themselves?
Is that the reason why? I heard something different, but I don't know too much about the issue.
Say that again.
I can tell you what I heard, but what I heard.
I'm sorry, Prime's point on the vaccination. I missed what he said exactly.
Yes, so Israel has an incredibly high vaccination rate. They've actually done a fantastic job vaccinating the people. As I understand it, from the last number I saw, that Palestine only had a 2% vaccination rate of its people. It's because they just can't get Socrates. We can hear all of the bag. We can hear everything, buddy. If you could please move. Thank you, buddy. As I understand it, they simply aren't allowed to. They don't have access to the vaccines. So, because of their limited reach. So, how do they take care of their own people?
Okay, so I heard a little bit of that when it comes to the blockades, and it's false. It's wrong.
Okay.
There could be periods of time when certain blockades were in place that may have had the intention of trying to block like arms. Those blockades have been determined to be illegal under international law, have been determined to be criminal, have been determined to be a human rights violation. I think both by organizations internationally and inside of Israel. I'm sorry, I just ran up a hill. And it's clear why Israel is doing this. It's to put pressure on Gaza. It's
doing what?
Like
doing
this question of what is like land grab versus genocide.
No,
I don't think
Socrates,
Israel is.
What are they doing specifically? You said it's clear why Israel is doing this. What is specifically doing?
Oh, putting the blockades in place. It's just attempting to make that area totally uninhabitable, which is what's happening. It's an uninhabitable area of land. The water isn't safe to drink. The life expectancy is poor. There isn't much electricity. There's very little medicine coming in. And Israel, for all of its kind of international acclaim about its COVID vaccination rate, has not been sharing that with the Palestinians, it's pretty bad, right? So you can say like, oh, you're so cynical. Maybe, you know, Israel keeps doing these things that lead to the destruction of Palestinians accidentally, and maybe they're just worried about security. I feel like you can only say that so many times before you have to question. Maybe there's another motive that's very, very straightforward and self-serving. Yeah.
Okay, so Palestine seems...
One quick thing,
please, go ahead.
by the way.
Can I tell you what I heard about the vaccines?
Okay.
And I just I'm curious if there's anyone in chat who knows more about the issue or something, because I was hearing very different stories, and I haven't looked into it enough to know which one's true. So what I heard was that the reason why there were those difference of the vaccinations was because in the Oslo Accords, right, according to the requirement, like according to the original deal, is that the Palestinian Authority needs to has control over like the health of like Palestinians. So anything like vaccines and all that stuff is up to the Palestinian Authority, not to the Israeli government, because they're two separate nations. And this was something that Yasser Arafat wanted to prevent, say, like Israel forcing them to do certain medical things, etc. Right? Like you can imagine why they wouldn't want Israel to have control over them medically. But so that's why Israel didn't have any kind of control over like getting vaccinations and all of that stuff. Apparently Israel accepted one vaccine that was easier to get access to, and the Palestinians didn't want the same vaccine for some kind of political reason or some other reason, and they ended up going with the vaccine that ended up being much harder to get access to. So that's like what I heard about the issue, but I have no clue if that's true.
So to be sure, the Palestine. Hold on. Palestine has said that Israel has blocked vaccines. But yeah, so just because that's there are tons of articles on exactly this. But if you're saying there's multiple reasons for that, I can accept that. But to be sure, that's an actual thing.
So what I was going to say is in response to Eris's point. I'm not sure about the first one. I mean, considering what Israel has done in the past with Ethiopian Jews, I'm not surprised at all that Yasser Arafat would be against having the Israelis being in control of their health issues. But I think I'm pretty sure about the second one being very true, because I know they paid a very high price for their vaccine. I think the vaccine they were trying to get was supposed to be only like $20 or $21, I believe, and the Israeli government paid $68 per vaccine, which is why they were able to get their population vaccinated that fast. And I do believe if they were responsible for the health of Palestinians, they probably would have not put that high of a mark up. They would have probably not been willing to pay $68 per vaccine.
Okay, so here's just to take like a really kind of straightforward approach to this. Israel is occupying Gaza and the West Bank. They control the movement, they control the electricity, the water, they blockade medicine and doctors. So to say that they're preventing Palestinians from having access to these things and also aren't responsible for providing the vaccines, I mean, maybe there's some argument that like if it was like IDF medics came in with vaccines and like, hey, we're gonna put some 5G chips in you, maybe that wouldn't go well. But
it was rule lawyering, right? Like that was a narrative I heard. Yeah, that was a narrative. That's the narrative that went around in Israeli circles.
That's how they sold it. Is that?
Yeah. So but the thing is that like as we know, right, Israel's regularly broken the Oslo Accords. Like the Oslo Accords, like the idea that the Palestinians would be responsible for their own healthcare was also reliant upon, a bunch of other things like not getting bombed and no more settlements and their own state. and a lot of that kind of stuff. So, and no blockades, like you mentioned. So, like, yeah, it's just them rule lawyering because they regularly don't follow the Oslo Accords themselves. So they only follow it when it's useful for them.
Yeah. Okay. That totally. Yeah, I could see maybe there's some technicality that they're trying to use as a shield, but absolutely, I don't think there's any legitimate reason why they could not, give shipments of vaccines to the remaining hospitals that haven't been bombed yet to be administered.
Okay.
I
all right.
I mean, one of the things that I also heard is the reason that Israel was able to get as many vaccines as it did as quickly, in addition to the pricing thing, is that one of the things that Israel is doing, and I'm not sure if it's I heard about this way back when in news sites for vaccines or whatever, is that one of the things that they're doing is they're exchanging a lot of medical data about the vaccines with the companies that produce them, which is incredibly valuable because a lot of the data that we have about the vaccines comes from Israel, and yeah, so the idea that the Palestinian authorities would just kind of be yeah, Israel, you can kind of go and use our population for medical data is also I think incredibly unlikely scenario.
Okay. All right. So thank you all for that. Sam, you've been quiet for a while. Where is your where you're at, buddy?
I haven't really looked too much into the situation with the vaccine, so I'm not 100% certain on that. But I'm sure, from what everyone's saying, it seems like it's a little bit more complicated than just Israel's just not sending them vaccines. And we have to look into it a little bit more.
No, yeah, sure. But going back, because we went off on this vaccine tangent. But going back to the world and the responsibilities, what do you think about the U.S. and has it been an impediment? Can it be a better partner in the future, or has it been doing the best it could possibly be doing?
So I don't think it's doing the best it possibly could doing, and I kind of have a stance that's kind of there have been times where the U.S. has been an impediment, and there have been times that it's been a benefit to the peace talks, as Eris said that with the peace accords at Camp David, but I think that they could be doing more. I think what we've said here is where we've given them hardline stances of no new settlements, or we're going to stop giving you funds. Things like this could be way more helpful in the long run. We could also condemn things when we know that they're wrong, which we haven't really done. Japan, who's another country who's pro-Israel, had condemned the Israeli police force, the Jerusalem police force, from entering the mosque. These are things that we could have done that we just didn't as a country, right? So these are things that I think that we can do in the future that kind of make it so that we are a better ally for peace in that region rather than just a better ally for Israel.
Yeah, I would agree with that in the sense that, there are certain issues where we could do better. And, when it comes to other countries, even countries that are very closely allied with us, like Japan or the UK, they will be willing to, condemn certain things, vote yes on certain UN Security Council resolutions, whereas we will not. And I think part of that actually is probably, I think part of that can be optical, but even then, no, because sometimes this stuff happens when a Democrat is in power. So, I think the electoral politics optics can play into it, but even with a Democrat predator, I know Biden right now is stonewalling any resolution or talks in the UN regarding this issue. So I'm not sure if what we can do more and how to fix that, but I think we definitely can.
Okay.
Well, so just
if I
to
could be a little.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah. Well, just really quickly to call out some good stuff. So Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, the Squad, calling out some of this stuff. It's kind of unheard of in American politics. Bernie Sanders, back in the day, a year ago, whatever, calling out like a little bit calling out Israel. That kind of stuff is unheard of in American politics. It's insane. It's unbelievable. It's terrifying how much we pander to Israel. And that changing just within our own culture and within our own politics, being able to criticize a foreign nation that's doing war crimes openly, that would be a really good development.
Yeah, I don't. I don't think that some of those people have like a lot of credibility to stand on. But
So what about? Sorry, I'll let you finish your point, Ascraft. I'm asking the question. Go ahead, please.
so like anyway, there are issues with some some people that were mentioned and like their credibility on the issue. I mean, actually, no. Just like I'll come back to this point after I've like collected my thoughts.
Sure. Thank you. So what about the rest of the world? So this is always approached, at least in American media, from the U.S. perspective, and I'm really interested in what you all have to say about this. And like excluding the U.S. for just a second, what can anyone else do? Is everyone else simply a bystander to all other nations, simply a bystander to this, rather than being able to actively take part and affect, either push for peace or to exacerbate things? What do you think other nations can do? Like, for instance, Europe. What can Europe do? Are you aware of any relations to country like China? And what are the other players doing here? And do they have any sort of control at all, or is it just strictly
China should really try to help human rights in the Middle East?
Exactly.
Yeah, they totally care about human rights.
They care so much about Muslims.
They will be on top of it, I'm sure. But I'm saying I'm simply stating, like, what are their roles? Do you see any bad actors outside of the U.S. That could be making this worse, or actors that are actively trying to make the situation better? Just trying to get like a non-American view of this.
Yeah, so the United Nations, I don't think has like two legs to stand on when it comes to Israel, or like half the stuff when like it has, like a few things that Trump did very few correct things, right? But there's
wait, I'm sorry. Can you elaborate on, because I feel like I've heard this twice
about
now,
calling about calling like the
when it comes to Israel.
when it comes to like putting countries like Saudi Arabia on like the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. I think it like makes a mockery of human rights, right? Like it, he said very 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 few correct things, but when you have countries like Iran and like Saudi Arabia on like human rights councils, I think that makes a mockery of human rights councils, right? And the United Nations has
like
little
the actual
to none,
condemnations that they've leveled.
little,
as far as I've looked through them, they've been really
no,
solid.
Like it has little to no like credibility when it comes to solving anything when it comes to Israel Palestine.
Well, okay, it would be one thing if you said they have no two legs to stand on when it comes to human rights. I would agree to that, but when you said when it has no two legs to stand on when it comes to the issue of the Israel-Palestine conflict, I disagree. So, like, the point you're making now makes sense, but you shouldn't have said it has no two legs to stand on when it comes to Israel-Palestine. You should have said, the UN has no two legs to stand on when it comes to fixing human rights issues. Those are two very different statements.
So there's a huge difference between being like morally correct or something and being like effective at solving an issue, right? So I would say that the UN has called things pretty well. I would say conservatively calling out Israel, very, very conservatively. In terms of like solving the occupation, yeah, I mean, the UN hasn't simply like launched troops to say like, get the fuck out of the occupied territories, like you can't be here, this is illegal, you've been here for decades, you have to go. They haven't done something, nuclear like that. But I mean, what have they done that's like not totally on the ball when it comes to like calling out Israel? I'm not really clear what that could be referring to.
Who's that to specifically?
I mean, I guess to Azakreth, Eris, maybe you kind of mentioned something similar vein. I'm not sure exactly how much kind of overlap, but I feel like I'm kind of getting the sentiment that like the UN is biased. The U.S. has a bad track record. I'm not saying the UN is perfect. I'm not saying that I want the UN chips in my brain, right? But that was a joke, just to be clear.
No, but like the United Nations is biased against Israel, and the United States can be a benefit for peace. Like, for example, Camp David in the 90s. If the U.S. wanted to, they could probably negotiate a peace settlement.
So what's
and it does have the power, right? And I think that right now, what are the powers in the region that can negotiate a peace? I think Russia's out of the question. The United States seems to be the only one, because Israel won't trust the United Nations to negotiate anything, right?
Wait, so okay. So we need to be really, really clear. So
realistically, the United States, maybe the European Union, like in a theoretical world, right? In a theoretical world, but in a realistic world,
let's just back up.
Can't.
So this question of bias. So Einstein was really, really biased when it came to physics. He thought that there was this that maybe gravitational lenses could exist. Right, he was really biased when it came to different ideas in physics. It's not called bias when you call things that are accurate. The UN has targeted Israel with lots of resolutions because Israel keeps doing lots and lots of war crimes and human rights violations. That's not biased. That's just looking at the world and saying what's happening.
Sometimes they've been accurate.
So this question of maybe Israel won't like that. That's sorry.
Yeah, but sometimes they've been accurate in their criticisms, right, or in their resolutions against Israel, and sometimes they've been really inaccurate. It's always been what is politically useful for the UN to do, based on like the motivators and the people who are pushing through those resolutions, right?
So they've been
this has been a problem with the UN for a long time, right? Like the UN, for example, gave zero fucks about Rwandans and Tutsis when they were being genocided.
Yeah. There's lots of genocides that they've turned a blind eye to.
Sudan, but that's what I mean. Is that like,
of course,
I just don't trust them historically. I've seen them be biased for Israel, and I've seen them be biased against Israel.
So what's an example of them being biased against Israel, other than maybe calling out accurately human rights violations in Israel, while maybe not calling them out somewhere else, right? That's a charge that I've heard that I think we could discuss. But what's something that they've been unfair about ruling toward Israel, or have been kind of hyperbolic in their statements, or fabricated?
The 1970s
what's an example of that?
They even recognized that they were biased against Israel in that situation, because they pulled it back in the 90s, where in the 1970s
what was the resolution?
It was to declare.
Sorry, I don't mean to source.
No, it's fine. To declare Zionism as racism, right?
Mm-hmm. So that's something that I could probably argue for, that it is. Okay. Maybe it doesn't help.
Yeah, but the UN actually disagrees with you now. That. So but yeah, that was.
Well, then the US is wrong. They suck. I don't trust them. No.
No. I mean, the United Nations disagrees with you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the thing is that even if you could argue that there are state aspects to Israel, which I do disagree with, or you could say that Zionism equals racism. The entire movement of Zionism is very similar to other Arab nationalist movements. So you would have to be against basically all forms of nationalism, which is totally fair. Noam Chomsky is legit and is and against that too. But to call it all racism is just it's a nonsensical criticism, and the UN
I think it's
recognized
whether
that.
It's politically expedient is.
No. It's nonsensical, right? Especially considering they never ever made a resolution about any form of nationalism that is actually ethno-nationalism before. So why would they pick one country to do that? That's a little strange. Well, it's the first time they've ever done that. Almost every country in the Middle East, has for example, Muslim symbology, symbols, in their flag and in their
I don't
entire
think that's
structure.
really the same thing as saying we want to move these people out of our homes because we want to live there and we don't want any Arabs in this area.
Wait, that's not what Zionism means. That's not what Zionism means, right? Like there's like a total misunderstanding.
So this is where we get into like a complicated, like historical analysis.
It's not that
complicated.
So we're gonna do this one at a time, all right? So Socrates make a point, and then Aristocracy, you can respond, please.
So this is something that we could do a really, really deep dive, because I think that this is a complicated issue when it comes to like what historically, materially is Zionism. What are the goals of Zionism? Like, can you put one thing as this is Zionism? Zionism has been, you know, conceptualized in different ways by different people, and there've been different groups within it.
Yeah, but
I think that's
I agree with you. There's many different versions of Zionism.
Tonight.
Like there's many different versions of Zionism.
Aris, please.
Sorry.
Let me finish, please.
Mm-hmm. But just so this is now what I've heard twice, as the UN said that they went too far on calling Zionism racist. Okay, that's one of the at least dozens of resolutions regarding Israel from the UN. Maybe one of the less impactful ones, because I haven't read that specific resolution, but it doesn't sound like it carries any particular kind of like advice or like requirements behind it. When it comes to like resolution 242, 497, like exiting out of the West Bank, exiting out of the Golan Heights, you can't take territory in war. You can't bomb civilian buildings. Like, are these bad? Is there something substantial that's wrong, or is it just this one resolution? That's
Wait,
like,
okay, so the American government has committed, the American government has regularly committed war crimes, right? Participate in ethnic cleansing and all that stuff.
Oh, hell yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So what I define, say, when I'm talking about the ideology behind, I guess, like the foundation which America started on, right? I guess, like, you know, democracy, anti-monarchist ideology. So could I go say like that being an anti-monarchist means that, you know, you also support like war crimes and all that stuff? Because
monarchy is the only way. Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels that you could draw between the U.S.'s founding and Israel's founding. With Israel, the fact is it's happening now. If the UN existed when the U.S. was wiping out its indigenous people, I think it would be an unbelievable.
Okay, but Jews are indigenous to the region too, right? So like,
okay,
and
what does that?
Okay.
What does that have to do with?
No, but you're acting as if like that they're not, right? So
well, Jews,
and on top
Jews
of that,
from Russia aren't. Jews from America aren't. I mean, that's a question. If your family lived there for many generations, then you are. Right, but I don't think that's really what indigenous means in this context, right? It's talking about the people who lived there before the nation
don't have a right to immigrate.
First of all, Jews have always been indigenous to the region as a whole, as a group, right?
Yeah.
And okay, and so, but I have a question, right? Do you support like land back movements for indigenous people in like the Americas?
Yeah, I do. I mean,
okay. So it's very similar to Zionism.
If you want me to say that the UN should call out a lot more, I agree. And this question of, you know, is the UN too focused on Israel versus other places? That's a conversation we could have, but to say that it's like biased when it's calling out real things that are happening, I don't. There are double standards when it comes to the US. Of course, the US has an unbelievable amount of influence, as is evidenced by the fact that it keeps vetoing these like totally universally endorsed resolutions from the UN. Of course, the US has too much power in the UN, absolutely. But I mean, I think calling out Israeli war crimes is one good thing that the UN does. Saying that we can't trust it because it doesn't call out more bad things, it's a fair criticism, but I don't think it undermines calling out the legitimate concerns, right? I mean, that just feels like a
wait.
Weird
of course, it's
argument
important, right? Because when you're trying to judge whether or not something is like a fair arbiter of like justice, and the like the idea that there being a fair arbiter is not recognized, right, or not demonstrated in their actions, then when they do call out Israel, it means very little to the Israeli people, or to Jews around the world, or to anyone who supports Israel, right? So if, for example, the UN was historically more fair, because I mean, when it was useful for the UN to be in support of Israel, when Israel literally was committing war crimes and ethnic cleansing, the UN had nothing to say about it, right? In 1948, the Israeli military literally ethnically cleansed 700,000 Palestinian refugees. The UN gave 0 fucks. So the UN as a whole, I'm just not going to see them as any kind of like authority on moral truth or anything. If they are specifically correct in those specific instances, like say condemning Israel for using white phosphorus in the 2007 Gaza war, then I'll like, to me, it has nothing to do with the UN. I'm just like, it's disgusting that they broke international law, right? And used white phosphorus. So but I'm not going to necessarily like trust, but it's not going to be because like the UN needs some kind of specific issue.
Well, I don't think we need to rely on the UN to decide our morality, right? The UN is an international organization that has many countries as members. There isn't really something like it aside from the UN that has like more teeth, right? So the US can kind of act more unilaterally, but obviously we're one country. We're not an international community. I think it's. I think it's
part
relevant.
of an international group that has teeth, though. The UN has 0 teeth. You want to know what does have teeth? NATO.
Sure. I think, yeah, I mean, if NATO, got together and decided like, hey, we're going to put a stop to this, that would be amazing. I think it's less, right? So one reason that the UN can call things out is because they have less of a requirement to act. It's a catch-22, of course, right? NATO could enforce a lot of these resolutions very strongly. The UN can't with like a 10th or 100th of the vigor, right? That NATO could.
Well, that's because
this also gives them more leeway to call things out. It's kind of a catch-22. That's true.
Yeah, I mean that's because the UN doesn't have military forces, but it was like purposely designed that way. It mainly only has peacekeeping forces as well as other troops for very specific and niche areas. But yeah, like that is true. Like NATO does have military forces that it has used in the 90s, like in the Balkans and in Kosovo. But I don't see that being really used.
Technically untrue. The UN does have did use an army before in Korea, right? The only time and the only reason that they did that is because the Soviet Union decided to foolishly boycott the United Nations for not recognizing the People's Republic of China. And so they didn't get to veto the creation of a UN military force to go and attack Korea. Well, no, not attack Korea, defend South Korea from the north, basically. And it was put under the command of the Americans in the Security Council. So the Security Council technically does have that power, except it's never going to be used for, I think, some like fairly good reasons.
Well, that's because we now have the Big Five. Like the UN, keep in mind, the UN was very young during the Korean War, and the Big Five were not a thing.
Well, no, they were. The Soviet Union could have vetoed the resolution. Instead of vetoing the resolution, they decided to boycott United Nations proceedings over the United Nations refusal to acknowledge the transfer of, like, quote unquote, being China from the Republic of China, which is now Taiwan, or they're still the Republic of China officially.
Well,
right?
no,
but they
China...
control Taiwan to the communist Chinese government that is now controlling the mainland.
Move too
the UN,
far from the actual subject at hand.
Yeah. Anyway, technically, the UN does have that, but the UN, I don't think, is anywhere near like a trustworthy organization when it comes to the topic of Israel, especially considering like a lot of the times they go overboard in quote unquote, calling them out. And I don't disagree that like every single time that they've done a thing, it's been because Israel has done something bad. There's a lot of electoral issues that go on, like when you have one country, one vote, and you do have a lot of countries that are very fervently, very anti-Israel, that are a powerful enough bloc to be able to get, seats on UN human rights bodies. And like when you have this hyper focus on Israel, and when you get stuff wrong about Israel, and when you call the existence of the state of Israel a racist endeavor, you don't have any moral leg to stand on. You don't have any legitimacy to like arbitrate.
That's not something the UN has done.
That you don't have any legitimacy to like arbitrate that thing because nobody trusts you. Like when you don't have
but
the
that's
trust.
false though. That's not true. The UN has not called the existence of Israel like racism or saying that Israel should be wiped off the map. That's That's just false. That's not
But
true.
Zionism does mean the existence of Israel.
Okay. If
And you
Okay,
could say there's many definitions of Zionism. I agree with
you're
you.
Jewish. We have probably different definitions of what Zionism means. If that's something we can disagree on, then that's a conversation to have. I don't think Zionism itself, the ideology, is literally equivalent with the existence of the nation state of Israel. Like, one is a geopolitical reality and one is an ideology. I don't think that you can say these things are literally the same. And to say that one thing,
I mean,
it's the most common definition of Zionism, and there's multiple definitions, right? But it does say something that the UN took one specific definition, the most gross definition of it, and then they use that.
The founding and the early colonies of America were supremely racist and slaves. That doesn't mean that America should be wiped off the map, right? So I think there's some dots that are missing there that you would need to connect if you want to say that saying that Zionism or some founding ideology is racist is the same as I want to wipe this country off the map. The UN recognizes Israel as a nation. It makes no sense.
I'm confused on your point. Are you trying to say that like Zionism means today that like it refers to people who want to wipe off Palestine off the map? Like
I think that there are arguments to be made that in its 40s form that those were components behind it. That's an argument that I think could be made.
But we don't use words defined by their original meanings. Words change their meaning, right? This is.
Wow. Thank you for making that point. Because if Socrates, if you made that point, I would have like literally jumped on your side, because this is actually a problem I've had with the word Zionism, and it's why I specifically, stopped with the Zionist stuff, because while I use Zionist to refer to its original definition, like Erist does, I agree with Erist's definition of Zionism, but I also kind of understand where Socrates is coming from, because it has evolved to refer to people with certain political beliefs.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that its original definition is worse, or arguably at least worse, than simply Israel has a right to, there should be some state, some Jewish refuge somewhere. I do not think that is the entirety of what Zionism originally entailed, but that's like a complex historical ideological
Zionism means the
conversation,
existence
right?
of Israel as a Jewish state, right?
Correct.
Okay.
I feel like almost all definitions, like there's definitely different versions of that, right? But at least like that basic, every version has those basics in it.
Well,
and if we want to even go back further, like it doesn't even, the Jewish state didn't even have to be in Israel. That was like not originally what Zionism was about. It was just creating.
So this is what I'm saying. There's disagreements about exactly what Zionism is. Can we all agree that whatever ideologically Zionism meant in the 40s or means today, it's not literally the state of Israel? Okay. We can all, hands up if you think that Israel should be wiped off the map or shouldn't exist, right? Nobody here thinks that. The UN doesn't think that. The UN recognizes Israel as a nation. So this is just a red herring to say that was the original point, was that.
But this is why the UN literally took back its resolution, right? Because they recognized that was literally the argument. They presented that exact argument. I think it was it John Kerry?
I could take a look at the.
I think it was John Kerry. I forget who. It was a U.S. official who literally used your exact argument to say like how it made no sense that the UN would have made this kind of resolution, right? When it like literally it already recognizes Israel, and that resolution went against that recognition. So they took back.
That's not my argument at all. But my argument is the exact opposite. It's the exact
I know, but it was
opposite.
the first part of the argument, and then they used it against it. And so,
I'm not sure how.
But that's,
my own words are somehow being used against me, right? So the founding ideology of a nation, of any nation, could be extremely racist. That doesn't mean that we should wipe that country off the map. There's no contradiction here. This is very clear. Right?
Okay,
is there any?
But the founding, but it's not. It's not about like just the founding of the nation. It's just Israel existing as a Jewish state, right? They define Zionism as Israel existing as a Jewish state, and they define that as being racist, right? Because, and this is a very common idea, right? So I'm not really sure like why you're kind of disagreeing with this, right? And I'm sure there's tons of people in chat who think that the idea of Israel existing as a Jewish state is racist,
I don't
right? Because it's a racist against, because they think it's racist against people who are not Jewish. So that's why they consider it an ethno-state.
So I mean, so do we want to have that conversation? I don't really have like the link to that. I think I have kind of the unpopular, less common position that Zionism in its original form is potentially more racist or more malicious in its implications than simply there should be some Jewish state somewhere and we should peacefully cohabit and exist.
That makes
right.
zero
I think
I disagree with
anyways, tons of people in the chat are all saying
right.
that like they see.
Well, okay, let's not listen to.
I think that's a little bit less fruitful, probably. I think right. We can all agree that Israel has a right to exist. They're a nation. They have a right to self-determination. They have a right to existence, safety, security. Right. Like that's not difficult to say, and that's something that the UN acknowledges. So the statement that the UN right, we can recognize there's a difference between ideology and right. So like if we could say that like Nazism, Nazism, fuck, why can't I say that? Is like a racist ideology, right? We could probably agree with that. That's different than saying that therefore we should wipe in like the 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, wipe Germany off the map, right?
I mean,
those are different.
We should have wiped Nazi Germany off the map.
There is also a difference between these two things, right?
Like, I want to nuance that a bit.
Yeah.
Like Israel and Zionism is in no way comparable to Nazism. What are you talking about?
Hold on. You're not calling for genocide, are you, Askrath, of the German people?
Against Germans.
No, I think what Askrath is saying...
Shadows. No, Askrath. You're not calling for...
No, but like Nazi Germany did not deserve to like exist at all.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It should be wiped off the map. And so when you're saying that this is a racist ideology that should be wiped off the map,
okay, buddy,
right?
You are Askrath, hold on, please stop. Don't talk over me. I'm trying to ask you some questions here. So are you saying that when you're saying Nazi Germany is wiped off the map, are you saying that the government should have been dismantled, or are you saying all those people should have died?
The government should be dismantled. Those in charge of it, like Nuremberg, was definitely a good thing. But I think what you're doing is you're misunderstanding. Like the situations are incredibly different. The people, right, that are advocating, for like the fundamental ideology, right, behind of a lot of people that are advocating for example, in the Middle East, like against the existence of the state of Israel, are people that think that Israel does not have the right to exist as a state, and neither do the Jewish people have a right to exist on that land. When people, like that is another thing that is very common. Like the phrase "from the river to the sea," right, is a reference to, we need to kick out all of the Jews, right, from the land, and that these people do not have the right to have, their own country. Right,
okay.
Like the idea.
That's a dodge,
right?
Though, because that's not what we were talking about.
Because when you talk, I'm calling your entire, like my first point was to call your entire statement disanalogous to the situation, and I'm explaining why it's absolutely disanalogous.
Could you answer the analogy first, and then we can.
Well, no, if it's disanalogous, then there's no use. If it's
so you're not gonna answer.
No, it's disanalogous. It's absolutely disanalogous.
Okay, so...
And when you have like people like the idea of Zionism is that Israel has the right to exist as a state, and that furthermore, right, because of like when Israel was founded, in the wake of a very big historical event to happen to the Jewish people, and when millions of them were killed in Europe, and following not thousands of years, but actually thousands of years of them just being oppressed by everybody around them, right? Quite literally for thousands of years, coming to the conclusion that the only people that can defend Jewish people are other Jewish people. I don't think that that's like, because it was quite literally true, right? Like there is, and so the idea that, that Zionism or that Israel should exist as a state, right? Because the Jews no longer trust anybody else to have their best interest in mind, because history has shown over and over again that whenever something wrong happens, it's always the Jewish population that gets blamed in all these countries. I like to call that a racist endeavor. And to call that a racist endeavor, I think, is absolutely disanalogous to saying a country that is currently engaged, in. Anyway,
I don't know if Sam already pulled this card for me. I don't know if I want to pull it again, but maybe I will. I am Jewish. My family fled Russia because of the pogroms. Family that died in the Holocaust. I get that Jews have been oppressed. There's this picture of this woman at a protest holding up a sign like my family didn't die in the Holocaust for me to bomb Palestinians. This is
But we're not arguing. Wait.
Dangerous. Wait. This is just something I need to respond to. This is a very dangerous idea within the Jewish community. I'm calling it out from within, calling for reform, calling for this bad idea to not be present. That Jews have been oppressed for so long, so whatever we do, carte blanche is okay. It's not okay to subjugate other peoples because we were subjugated. I'm sure that's not what you were saying, but that's an idea that exists out there.
So Sam,
hold on. Can I respond to that?
Hold on, Shadows. Sam, do you want to say something? And then we'll go to Shadows.
Yeah. I just think that I don't think that we're saying that Zionism inherently means that you have to bomb Palestinians. I think that's a little bit. I don't know if Azarkrath was inferencing that, but it didn't seem like it. And the other thing is that we have to understand that Zionism started because because of this persecution of the Jewish people in Europe a lot. They were just trying to find a place that they could be safe in away from the safe from this persecution. That's why they didn't really originally care that it was Israel, but they landed there because there was already a large amount of the Jewish population there, right? Yes. This is kind of why they've. So it's not.
That's one reason. Of course, the historical and religious roots. That's a piece of it. Of course.
Well, actually, at the time, there was a lot of Jewish people that did not want the Jewish state to be in Israel because in the Torah it says that the only time that the Jews would return to Israel and create a state is at the end times, right? Yep. It is so. This is something that we need to make sure that we understand and contextually understand that Zionism in its form was just to try to make a place where Jewish people felt safe. From the persecution that they were feeling in Europe. It is important, but that doesn't mean that Zionism inherently means that they want to bomb and get rid of Palestinians.
Well, surely not. Yeah. So I know that we don't like analogies in here, but to give another analogy, just really quickly, the American settlers left the UK because they wanted freedom and they wanted religious freedom and freedom from tyranny. But of course, there have been religious kind of zealot elements within America for a really long time. We've subjugated other peoples. So just because some kind of movement began with the yearning for freedom and independence doesn't mean that it couldn't go wrong in other ways, right? That's just a very obvious statement.
Go ahead, Shadows.
Sorry.
So the point I was going to make is, I guess, to respond to Sam briefly, that is technically true, but Zionism does specifically respond to the idea of having a Jewish state that allows for Jews to have self-determination. Yes, it doesn't have to be Israel, and there are Jews who are against it because they believe that the land is supposed to be returned to them by the hand of God himself, rather than, say, the British kingdom, which is, what created a Jewish Palestine, which was obviously later named Israel. But that aside, I think, hold on. Sorry. I think, Socrates, the point you were trying to make when you were mentioning that protest makes sense. That, this person's ancestors didn't die just for Israel to subjugate Palestinians. But I think that is the problem with the word Zionism. I think your argument that what Zionism originally meant could have been a lot grosser than just, the creation of a Jewish state. That doesn't make sense because I think it's the opposite. I think at the beginning, its intentions were more pure, more correct. And I think today it has sort of morphed into something that sort of means something else. And I'm saying that specifically because I know that from experience. And Prime knows exactly what I'm talking about. I literally had a discussion one-on-one with Spectre about the word Zionism and how a lot of people gave me a lot of flack because I called myself a Zionist. And the reason why is because I am in favor of Israel existing. I believe it is important for Jews to have the right to self-determination, to have their own state. But Spectre is like, why do you call yourself that when Israel does all these awful things? Because a lot of people, including Jews, like Spectre, see the phrase Zionism and think it is very political. It has to do very specifically with the actions of the state of Israel. And I've also had Jewish friends in real life who have, had some very seething criticisms of Zionism or the Jewish state. And so I think it has sort of evolved. I think a good comparison, I don't get your America comparisons, but I think a good comparison in terms of words and vocabulary would be the word feminist. A lot of people, when they call themselves a feminist, say they just believe in the political, social, and economic equality between men and women. And I think a lot of feminists do believe that. But I think there are a lot of feminists that also believe something else, something beyond that has sort of caused society to change its definition of feminism and think something else. So there's more than just that original definition. It attaches a lot more to that than just that original definition. And I think the same thing has happened to Zionism. It attaches a lot more than just, believing Jews have the right to their own state and self-determination. But it has a lot of political connotations with Israel and Israel's actions.
Okay, so
we're also kind of like thinking about this absolutely.
Wait, no, I want to hear Socrates' response.
Yeah, sorry.
Sure. So I just wanted to kind of revisit these like several different kind of tangents we've been on. So I said controversial statements like a founding ideology of a country isn't identical to its political reality. I said extreme divisive statements like a people founding a new nation may have goals of freedom for themselves or independence, but that doesn't mean that they'll never subjugate anybody. I've said things such as an originally racist project for a country may lead to a country that nonetheless should still be recognized as a state and exist. I know these are all pretty controversial, difficult to follow statements, but I'm happy to
I don't know,
defend.
It feels like you're being a little facetious.
I would never do that. I don't know what that word means. Right, but that's literally the core of everything that I just said, because the things that I've tried to defend are really, really clear. Are things like maybe Zionism could be racist. I would argue that it could be, right? That's a conversation that I think we could agree at least that we could have. That there's potentially some historical context to that, but that it's irrelevant to Israel as a state today in the same way that it might be irrelevant to the U.S. or even to Germany, although we never really came to a resolution on whether Germans should be, have it taken away and given to Spain or something. These are actually like really straightforward things to understand. I'm not totally clear why I'm getting kind of pushed back on these things.
I don't think anybody disagrees with any of those premises. It's the fact that you're equating Zionism to the same thing as being racist from the get-go. And I think that's the contention that people are having here. That if you take the definition of Zionism, that the Jewish people just wanted to create a nation for themselves somewhere, then that's not inherently racist in any way. You said that Zionism, with your statement saying that a project or a founding of a country that is inherently racist may still have the right to exist. They're just saying that we're saying that idea might not be racist, that Zionism inherently was not racist at the start. That's the contention, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. So we could talk about that. We could have a conversation about that. I started trying to pull up some sources. Red Charlotte very helpfully has sent me some links to things that I've seen in text before, talking about Herzl and kind of these original ideas of how, like, logistically it would take for Israel to be founded, to exist within this area of land in which other people already lived. But I don't know why we keep skipping over the fact that that's irrelevant, right? So we could talk about whether Zionism in its original form or some other form could have racist or colonial elements to it, but that is irrelevant to whether or not Israel should exist today. Does anybody disagree with that point? With that?
Yeah,
Okay.
No.
But
I
the
think one
majority
the
of
things that
Israelis,
actually
right?
sorry.
So the majority of Israelis today, even Israelis who are extremely left wing, even Israelis who I think that like Israel needs to be tried according to believe that they're participating in a genocide, etc. Right? Like the most left wing Israelis still call themselves Zionists, right? Because Zionist literally is just another word for believing in Israel as a Jewish state. That's just like that's just the colloquial definition there, right?
Fine.
But if you're on Twitter,
That's
Zionist means something very different, right? So that's why I choose
I would
whether
never
or not
use that cursed hell site.
Oh well, yeah, but that's why I choose whether or not I define myself as Zionist, depending on the context, because it obviously means
I'm looking at
different
like
things to
writings
people.
from the original founders in like the 30s
Or like
and
Theodore
40s.
Herzl.
That's what I'm looking at. That I'm basing. Yeah, that's what I'm looking at to base those. I'm not looking at like Twitter, right? And if so, I don't think it's an argument to say that like lots of Israelis call themselves this, right? Like if I were to say like lots of Americans call themselves America Firsters, which is literally echoes.
Yeah, but it's just
Nazi
the definition.
sentiments.
Like I googled Zionism definition. It's like that's what just comes up.
Okay, well, if that's the definition,
it's just like
for Google,
the reestablishment and the
development
and the protection of the Jewish nation in what is now called Israel.
And also, we're forgetting. I think we're losing like a lot. Like one of the things that I think people are losing right now is the absolute context of like when this whole thing was about, and this was about like the United Nations and the countries that brought it forward. And when the United Nations called Zionism a racist endeavor, it was like countries in the United Nations did not believe that Israel had the right to exist. Like this was the actual situation. So this wasn't even like an abstraction. So like we've completely abstracted what we were talking about in combination with like the actual practical applications and the beliefs of like people on the ground when they're making statements like, for example, Zionism is racism. They are also making the connection that Israel shouldn't exist at all. Like this is not like hyper academic speak. Like when you're talking to like actual real people.
Yeah, I'm looking.
And
all the countries did not recognize that voting favorite did not recognize its right to exist.
Yeah, that's true. Originally, not all countries recognized Israel. I'm not sure.
No, but all the countries that voted in favor,
do.
right? Like I'm just looking at the list right now. Like Afghanistan didn't recognize, Bangladesh didn't recognize it, Brazil didn't recognize it, Pakistan didn't recognize it, etc.
Okay. So, sure. So.
So you don't think that's like a coincidence?
I'm just trying to connect these things.
Well, so I think what she's trying to say is every single country that didn't recognize Israel either did it for a very political or religious reason. Like if you look at the countries that do not recognize the state of Israel and are not Muslim, you have a very small group of countries left. And most of them are either all Russia or US or USSR aligned.
So what's the connection here? What is this all supposed to mean? I feel like there's some grand narrative being built.
Yes.
What are we supposed to do with this information?
Is what you're doing is you are trying to going back to the thing of grand narratives is that like in the real world, right? Reality kind of aligns itself one way. And when we're talking about like the specific situation and like the discussion like stemmed from a specific situation of like the United Nations saying a thing, and like when you're saying, well, in theory, academically, something could technically, but in the real world, when countries were making these declarations, it was to say that Israel does not have the right to exist. Like that was what these countries were saying.
If that's the connection, then we're gonna have to look at like those resolutions, right? So when was that vote cast? In which like lots of countries didn't recognize Israel, and when was that resolution made?
It was cast in 1975, and it was taken away in 1991.
Okay. And when did that vote occur? about Israel being recognized as a country, that must have been much earlier, right?
1947.
Okay, so Israel.
So these are three different
is-
significant eras.
Right, absolutely. So this is what I'm saying, that like I'm not totally clear how, like, there's of course crossover between these different concepts and different things. Of course, there might be countries that say Israel shouldn't exist because it's Zionist and Zionism is racism or something. Like, I'm sure that connection has been made somewhere. I'm not saying like ahistorically this thing. But this is a pretty in the weeds kind of argument to make when we're talking about so there's a difference between the UN, every nation within the UN. There's a difference between what exists right now and what like
so
projects are flawless. I'm not really seeing like a lot of nuance in the way that these kind of connections are being made, right? So we all agree now that Israel has the right to exist. We don't agree currently. There isn't consensus between us in terms of whether there are potentially like racist or colonial elements within Zionism during some period of time. That's something that we currently disagree on, right?
I take serious issue with saying that there are like colonialist roots within Zionism.
I'm just gonna. Okay.
I'm sorry. That just comes off as super yikes, because as someone who like has to, who has like dealt with people like people who are trying to criticize Israel in a healthy manner, and I've had to tell several people on my personal Instagram that you cannot just like call Israel a settler colony, because that just comes off as anti-Semitic.
I'm sorry. That's not reasonable. That's not reasonable. That's not logically like connected.
Well,
Okay.
when most people say settler colony, they're saying that they don't have a legitimate right to exist.
Yeah,
that's what they mean. Just to let you know, I don't know if that's what you mean, but that's what when I see Twitter, that is the argument that I'm seeing.
Can we please not appeal to like very?
But so what?
No, but this is not
go ahead, Sam. Finish your point, and then we'll go back to Socrates.
The consensus of when people say that that this is the what they mean on when people are talking about it, this is what the argument you're making for Zionism. No, this is what you're saying when this is what when generally people believe, right? So why should we do it for your definition of Zionism, but not for the definition of saying that Israel is a colonial state, right? The idea that like people are saying that Israel is a colonial state and therefore should, but that is, but in general, that's what people are saying.
I don't know what this is. This people in general, this Twitter people in general. I would really like to not appeal to.
He's referring to the genuine colloquial definition, right? And way. Since before you wouldn't accept a definition, then the other argument was that you're okay.
So America is a settler colonial state. Australia is a settler colonial state. I think that they should have a right to exist.
So Europeans are not.
These aren't contradictory.
So
they're just
Europeans are not indigenous to America. Like I don't understand how that's possible.
Yes, agreed.
It seems like
agreed.
When we're using this term, so it seems like some people are attaching like a moral to this, right? So colonial, or a prescription to this. Like, okay, it should not exist, right? Like it is some sort of corruption of that area, right? But settler colonial, is that I understand. You guys can disagree, but settler colonial is simply describing how the state was formed and expanded, right?
Okay, sure. Then let's talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we move it to that?
It's literally
then?
descriptive. It's not prescriptive.
Okay. Yeah. No. I agree. Let's take the morals like totally out of it, right? But like let's deal with that claim that Israel is a settler colonial state. Now, I would agree with you. I think it's actually very hard to not define, for example, the settlers in like the occupied territories like East Jerusalem, West Bank, or Gaza as being settlers, right? You could probably also argue it's colonial, though that's probably like a weird definition for the word. But either way, it's settlers, right? But like how is Israel itself, like the founding of Israel, the original partition plan in 1947, all that stuff, like how is that a colonial state? Like I just like to hear the argument.
So just to pull one of these out. There's lots, just because it's people saying credibility in chat. What are you talking about? As early as 1895, Theodor Herzl, the prophet and founder of Zionism, wrote in his diary in anticipation of the establishment of the Jewish state, "We shall try to spirit the penniless Arab population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our country. The removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." Right. So there's writings within Herzl's journals in terms of talks between different Zionist founding leaders, thought leaders within this movement, that in order for this state to be established, the removal or movement of the indigenous Arabs there would have to be carried out in some way. Netanyahu talked about, just more recently, kind of bridging past the present, talked about how it was a great failing not to push out lots and lots of Palestinians when the Tiananmen Square massacre was happening, and so the eyes of the world were somewhere else. He's like, fuck, we should have carried that out then. These aren't crazy anti-Semitic racist ideas. This is looking at the original founders and their words and the implications of a lot of what would have to happen for some of the plans of this to be carried out. I don't expect anybody to take any of that my
there's
word
a reason
for it.
why
This
most
is my
historians, right,
perspective.
of Israeli-Palestinian history, don't use the term colonial to describe what happened with Israel, right? Because when you use the term say colonial state, you're describing basically the
Maybe colonial is kind of weird,
right? You're describing usually a very powerful powerful nation, right? Colonizing, creating a settlement in another area that they're non-indigenous to, okay, and taking its resources, right? I forget the exact term, but where you steal resources to the detriment of the land, right?
Yeah. So we usually think about that as an overseas thing. We don't usually think about it as neighboring, but that is, in a sense, that's what's happening. I mean, they're basically trying to take over that land,
for
and they are taking its resources,
but not for the foundation itself, of Israel. So I don't understand. What I do think
could we focus on maybe some other aspect of this, because that's
wait, because you made a claim and you can't.
I feel this isn't something that I came on prepared to elaborate on in great detail, because I don't think it's relevant to this conversation, and I feel really pulling the trigger on Zionism equals racism. That's not exactly my stance, but that's something that I'd like to be prepared to back up more deeply, because it's clearly a very unpopular perspective.
And once again, we remember we are completely divorcing any of the actual moralizing that's going on when people call Israel a settler colonial state, which kind of, I think, ignores the actual reality, is that this term has gained massive popularity now because of memes, right? And I think we've all seen the photo I'm talking about that has been going the rounds on social media to popularize this idea, makes the claim it's no, Israel is not the country, Palestine is the country, implying that the Jewish people do not deserve to be there, and that all of the settlement
these questions
Israel
of,
there is illegitimate. That's not. But when I'm talking to people, right, when I see this rhetoric, right, I'm talking about the actual real world effects, right, and what people are actually trying to say. I try to when I'm talking to people, when I'm talking about social movements, when we're talking about rhetoric, right, Israel is a settler colonial state. Right, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out what information people are trying to convey, right? And when I see those types of memes, when I see this, right, the information that people are trying to convey, we can try to figure that out, right, in a non hyper academic sense, right? Yep. And the information is Israel does not deserve to exist because it is an illegitimate state. This is something that this is something that I've heard. Can I have one more thing to say, right? So this is something that I've heard here. This is something that comes on very, very often, with my experiences dealing with BDS stuff on campus, especially, right? Is that people use it as a cover to do some pretty insidious stuff.
Yes,
right.
Totally agree. And there's a lot of really, really bad shit in the BDS TM. The BDS organization, like doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist, and that's fucked up. I don't support that. Nobody should support that.
But they use this
really
type of
bad.
rhetoric to justify their stuff, right? And like the BDS team organization, you know, like it's like they use a lot of this bad rhetoric to do this stuff. It's like, oh no, we just want to boycott. No, you don't just want to, like, you want to cripple the Israeli economy and make sure that it doesn't exist anymore. Like that's what you want to do. Like, and you're using a bunch of people who are
I don't have
like
a problem
who
with
are, I
boycotting
think the
Israel.
formal term
I
of
just
it
don't like
is
the
useful.
organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like but like
as
the
a
formal
tactic,
term,
it's like reasonable, but the organization has bad intentions.
And like
behind
they have bad intentions, and like a lot of people that are part of like the BDS like movements on campus are, like, I think the technical term for it are useful idiots, right? A lot of the people pushing it are like very, very bad people, and want to do very, very bad things. And like I've seen whenever it comes up on campus, like the Jewish population on campus feels scared to like show like any sort of like Jewish symbols. They cover up. Like one of my friends stopped wearing his yarmulke after BDS became a thing on campus, like because he was just afraid that, like, because Jewish organizations were targeted, like, and there's always an uptick in anti-Jewish like events on campus whenever it comes up. Like it's there's always stuff like that happens. There's always stuff that happens. Like there was another university that's right next to mine, right, where under the guise of BDS, right, basically they had an election in the student union and they had to confirm the election, and every single person was confirmed except for the Jewish people that got elected under the cover of their Zionists, right? They're BDS.
That's
they're this, they're that. Like it's just these types of experiences.
And
like,
this is widespread. There's an incident at my former university where like a Jewish student was like harassed and like, I don't know, shoved something called like a settler. Like there's absolutely really fucked up stuff. I really do appreciate you calling that stuff out, because that's a tendency within anybody who criticizes Israel that have to be so careful to criticize Israel in a really specific manner, to divorce like Jews, this idea that Jews generally are the same as Israel, which is something that Israel has pushed to a large degree, and Netanyahu has pushed. So like that's also a place where we need to put blame for that. But absolutely, Jews in general are not responsible for any of the actions of Israel. That's insane, but also very common, as you've said, that is something that exists in the world.
I do have to step out because I'm getting really tired.
We were about to end any which way, so we'll.
Oh,
okay, yeah. I mean, I guess it's
final statement.
Yeah, I mean.
Oh, well, hold on. Before you do that, to my audience, we are going to roll on to our open walk-on panel right after this. So I'm going to give an outro to each of my guests here before that happens. But the stream is not ending. The stream is not ending. Oh God, the stream is not ending. So stick around. We got more content coming your way.
Gotta make a meme of that shit.
I know, right? But okay. So we have more content coming. We're just going to give an outro to these amazing people. All right. Why don't we start with Shadows?
Okay. Thank you for having me, Prime. I wasn't expecting to go first, but it was good to be here. Good to have this discussion. I'm glad that I was able to be part of this. I know a lot of people, might have thought I was brought on for a reason, because of my past discussion with Spectre, or because of me having an Israeli flag. I usually don't talk about this that much. I used to talk about this a lot more, because every single time I would jump into like a voice chat, I would suddenly turn the entire room to talking about Israel. So that's why I was kind of trying to harp really hard on like the Zionist conversation topic, because I've had that problem myself. But I do sometimes talk about this when it's in the news. I generally just talk about other political stuff like economics and public policy. So if you're interested in just like a liberal talking about econ, public policy, and his political views, you can come over and check me out for that. If you also want to check me out for like piano stuff, If you're interested in music streams, you can also check me out for that because I do quite a bit of that. And yeah, that's about all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Aristocracy, thank you for coming on, especially last minute. As that happened, that was not our intention, but well, you know how it is to do these things. But Eris, definitely appreciate you sharing your perspective on everything here. It was very valuable. Eris, please.
I'm an Aristocracy. I'm a history streamer. I stream every day around 2 p.m. And I usually do history and sometimes I do interviews and all that stuff. Just in general, I'm less political, I guess. I know you're probably thinking I'm super political by tonight, but I'm actually less political and more concerned about what happened in the past. Just in general, especially when you consider something like what's going on right now with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I 100% believe in free Palestine. And I want the self-determination to happen for the Palestinian people and for Palestinians to not be going through the awful war crimes that they have been going through for 73 years. But I just but I just don't, I guess, fall into just one category, just automatically criticizing Israel. I don't think all criticisms of Israel are legitimate, and I don't think all criticisms of Palestinians are legitimate. So I try to see the nuance in the situation. But yeah. You should definitely follow me. And I also have a TikTok. I just made it, and it's really, really funny. It's really funny. It's just Aristocracy. It's really funny. Okay.
It's just that
Are you laughing that I have a TikTok?
No, not that. It's just that sometimes I feel you get super awkward for no particular reason. Literally no reason. Oh, sorry. All right, never mind. Eris, I always appreciate you. Eris has a channel. I've already shouted out Shadows of Liberty, but Eris has a channel, and I've shout that out too. And she, of course, has the thing that she didn't talk about, the Calipian Club. Exclamation for Eris in chat to be able to get to her Discord server, her very famous Discord server. Which is we can have fantastic conversations and not be blood sporty, so that's great. All right, next, Sam the Human.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Prime. It's always good to have these discussions. I felt like maybe the earlier half of the panel was a little bit more productive, where we were being able to talk about things outside of just definitions. But I understand that's kind of how debates go. When they get down to it, it sucks. But I'm glad that we did have some productive conversation here. You can find me at the Twitch Politics Discord. I'm a mod there. I'm usually there a lot of times of the day. I'm going to start streaming more. I do mostly machine learning and AI content. That's what I study in school, and mainly natural language processing and stuff like that. So if you ever want to learn a little bit more about computers and stuff, you can come here and learn.
Thanks so much, Ascraft. And I wanted to say to you, Ascraft, you are not Jewish. We have learned all together. But still, despite that, I want to say you're...
He's Orthodox.
He's Orthodox.
I am Orthodox, though.
Yes.
Well, you're still welcome inside of my heart.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I just want to say that I appreciate your perspective in all of this. So thank you so much, Ascraft. But go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I'm Azakrith. I don't really stream really, but if people like what they saw, I might start doing it, so I guess go to same name. I think you can see it right there spelled out. I don't know if I have a link or whatever. I don't know how to do that yet, but I might. And just look it up, follow and like and subscribe, as the people say on YouTube, right? If you really want to, and if you do, then I'll definitely show up for people if they want to see it. I'm kind of happy that we were able to end this all on an agreement, right? And that this didn't devolve into blood sports. I also want to give a shout out to Katarana. So if you go subscribe to her, she's really, really good. Even though she wasn't on here, she's not able to stream for a bit. So if you she's a really good, really cool person, does science stuff, and streams much more regularly than I do. So you can do that. If you really, if you want to subscribe to me, or follow me. I'm still just much more used to YouTube than to Twitch. Sorry, but like follow. And if you want to give me money, I'd appreciate. I won't complain.
Wait,
But
we were allowed to ask for money.
oh no, but like, aren't subscriptions like giving people money, right? On Twitch?
Yeah, I want money too.
Yeah.
you have to do a
Actually,
little
no.
on the panel. Of course you're
Subscribe
left
to
to
Eris. Subscribe
No,
to
I'm kidding,
Spam,
I'm kidding, I'm
sus-
sorry.
sus-
You
subscribe
can't
to
subscribe to
everybody
me
here.
yet, but you should come follow me and help me be
There
able
we
to
go.
get subscribed.
Okay.
Subscribe to everybody here, guys. Subscribe to everybody here. Go on all our channels, right? Like, subscribe to everybody here. You know.
Okay.
So,
Be
so
over
yeah,
by
but, yeah,
approved.
thank you everybody for the great conversation. Thanks for like keeping it civil. One other thing that I'm just gonna go out on and meme out. My last thing is just like all of our things about like definitions is just like postmodernism. Not even once is my take on that whole thing that devolved at the end. But we managed to come to an agreement, which was very nice.
Okay. Last but certainly not least, Socrates. Socrates, an incredible mod here. I don't get enough of Socrates in my life. It's something I'm always trying to change. But Socrates, thank you for coming in like halfway through all of this and sharing your
Yeah, you made it way more exciting.
yeah. That's what Socrates
I'm glad.
does. He's an exciting guy. But Socrates, thank you, seriously.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I know that I was brought on specifically because I am Jewish. Happy to play that card. I think I hope it's helpful to see a panel with multiple Jews vehemently disagreeing with each other on Israel, on Zionism, on lots of things. I hope that shows people a little bit more like depth, that we're not all a monolith. It's very important to say that like as a Jew, I don't have any responsibility to or about Israel except for the fact that motherfucking dumbass corrupt as shit Bibi Netanyahu comes out and says any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, and as a Jew I have to say, not in my fucking name, fuck you.
Hey.
It's not.
True.
You should be in jail, you piece of shit.
True.
When it comes to Israel, I don't like when things kind of go back to like the founding of Israel, because that's where things get like hazier, and there's different like history books that people have read, and the record takes a long time to correct, and the kind of he said she said history back and forth, tit for tat. Like
No.
Palestinians kill 6 Israelis kill
That's not what
like
the history.
20,000 Palestinians. Like I don't like that, going through that back and forth. I like looking at the here and now, which is that Israel is a very powerful nuclear state that is illegally occupying other people and needs to stop. And that's really as complex as you need to know on the first level of what is happening with this situation. So that's the message that I would like people to take away from me. But yeah, if you want to have me on more, just invite me on, and have more panels on Israel Palestine, or frothy shit that I feel very passionately about, but also still feel very, very uneducated on.
Just want to correct the record. We have multiple Jews and an Orthodox. Just being very clear here.
And an Orthodox, yes.
Who was actually the most pro-Israel person here? You know?
Pretty much.
True. He was the most pro-Israel
Interesting.
person.
That's why I thought he was I thought he was Jewish. That's my fault. I made an assumption. That's my fault. Okay.
Hey, look, well, I mean, it's not a mistake if we all had a happy conversation, right?
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
You know? Anyway, thanks for the opportunity to come on.
Yeah.
It's not bad until you start explaining why you thought he was Jewish. That's where it gets in the
Yeah.
Actually, it's pretty messed up. All right. Well, anyway, to you all, thank you so much. We're gonna be going to walk on panel. Anyone here is welcome to join us, but if not, that's okay. Thanks for spending your time, your energy, your passion, your knowledge with my community. I'm sure they appreciate it just as much as I do. Have a good one. Bye.